There was a woman who traveled thousands of miles to start her life anew and was rejected right in front of the whole town. Not because she was ugly, not because she was poor, but because she wasn't young enough by some other woman's standards. But instead of running away in tears, Clara Whitmore stood her ground. And from that humiliation, she built something no one could take away. If you love stories of women who refuse to give up, hit like now and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. Clara's journey begins now. The stagecoach pulled into Iron Hollow just past 2 in the afternoon, trailing a cloud of alkaline dust that settled over everything like a second skin. Clara Whitmore had been awake for 31 hours. She knew because she'd counted them. Each one of those hours marked by a milestone she'd cataloged to keep herself from losing her nerve. The Missouri border. The flat stretch of Kansas that went on so long she thought the driver might be driving them in circles. The night crossing of the Little Cimarron where the water came up to the wheel hubs, and she'd pressed her back flat against the seat and told herself to breathe. She smoothed her dress as the coach rocked to a halt. The fabric was navy wool, her best, but 3 days of travel had pressed wrinkles into it that no amount of smoothing was going to fix. She straightened anyway. It was the kind of thing you did. The town that greeted her was smaller than the letters had suggested. One main street, maybe 4 blocks of it, with a general store on one end and a livery stable on the other. Between them, a barber shop, a land office, a hotel with a crooked sign, 2 saloons, and what appeared to be a dry goods merchant whose front window had been patched with oilskin. The boardwalks were warped and the street was unpaved, and the whole place smelled of horse and sawdust and something faintly metallic that she couldn't identify. She stepped down from the coach on her own. The driver offered a hand, but she'd already moved past him, her travel bag clutched in both arms. Her eyes scanning the street for a face she'd never seen in person, but had spent 6 months imagining. Thomas Aldridge was easy to find. He was standing in front of the hotel with his hat in his hands, turning it at the brim in the way men do when they're nervous. He was taller than she'd pictured, with brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He was 34 years old. She knew this from his letters. He knew she was 31. She knew that too. What she didn't know was, what neither of them had properly accounted for, was the woman standing 2 steps to his left. Margaret Aldridge was maybe 60 years old, with the kind of posture that said she'd never once in her life slumped. She wore a dark dress buttoned to the collar, and her silver hair was pinned so tightly it looked painful. Her hands were folded in front of her. She was watching Clara's approach the way a judge watches the defendant walk to the stand. Clara crossed the street and stopped in front of them. Up close, Thomas Aldridge had kind eyes. She noticed that first. Uncertain eyes, but kind. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and extended his hand. "Thomas Aldridge. It's good to put a face to the letters." "Mr. Aldridge." She shook his hand. His grip was firm but brief, and when he let go, he didn't quite know where to look. "The journey was long, but I'm here." "You are," he agreed. He started to say something else, but his mother moved first. "How old are you?" Margaret Aldridge said. Not a question, a demand wearing the clothes of one. Clara looked at her. 31, ma'am. My son wrote to a woman of 24. The words landed without warning, the way a stone hits water, fast, then spreading. Clara felt the ripple move through her chest. She kept her expression still. "That was a misunderstanding in the correspondence. I can explain." "There's nothing to explain." Margaret Aldridge's voice was perfectly flat, the way a blade is flat. "Thomas requires a woman of childbearing age, a woman capable of providing heirs for what will eventually be a substantial property. You are 31 years old." She said it the way you'd say 45. "This arrangement cannot proceed." Thomas opened his mouth. "Thomas." Just the one word from his mother, and his mouth closed. Clara was aware suddenly of how many people were nearby. The street was not crowded, but it was not empty either. A man outside the barber shop had stopped walking. 2 women near the general store had turned to look. The hotel clerk had materialized in the doorway, not quite leaning out, but not quite staying in either. She made herself breathe. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, and she spoke to him directly, not to his mother. "We have exchanged letters for 6 months. You know my character. You know my capabilities. Whatever confusion arose about my age, Miss Whitmore." His voice was apologetic, but thin, like paper. "My mother has a point. The letters were... He paused. Perhaps we were both forming pictures that weren't entirely accurate. I was entirely accurate, Clara said. There was no heat in it. It was simply true, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. This conversation is finished, Margaret Aldridge said, and she said it loudly enough that the two women by the general store could hear it clearly. My son will not be entering into any arrangement with a woman who misrepresented herself. I suggest you return on the next coach. There's no coach back for 4 days, the hotel clerk offered helpfully from the doorway. Margaret looked at him, and he stepped back inside. Clara stood on the unpaved street of Iron Hollow with her travel bag in her hands, and the dust still settling on her shoulders, and she felt, for a long and terrible moment, as though the ground itself were deciding whether or not to hold her up. She did not cry. She was aware of this in an almost clinical way. The pressure behind her eyes, the tightness in the back of her throat, and then the choice she made without fully deciding to make it, which was not here. Not in front of this woman, not in front of this town that was already watching. She looked at Thomas Aldridge one final time. I hope you're happy, she said, and she meant it without sarcasm, which perhaps surprised him because he blinked. I mean that genuinely. I hope it works out. Then she turned and walked away. She didn't know where she was going. She had 4 days, $38, and a single bag. The hotel behind her was the natural destination, but walking back toward Margaret Aldridge's territory felt like retreat in a way she couldn't stomach. She walked instead toward the far end of the street, toward the livery stable, because it was far from the hotel, and the street went on in that direction, and she needed somewhere to put her feet while she figured out what to do. She made it about half a block before she heard it. Not loudly. A murmur, really, but she heard it because people in frontier towns do not modulate well when they think someone is beyond earshot. Poor creature. Well, you can't blame Margaret, 31 and no prospects. She lied to the man. What did she expect? Clara had not lied. She had written her age plainly in her second letter. What she suspected had happened was that Thomas had failed to pass that information to his mother, and now the version of events that would live in Iron Hollow's memory was Margaret's version, which was both cleaner and more damning. She kept walking. She reached the far end of the main street and stopped at the edge of it, where the boardwalk ran out and became just dirt. The livery stable was to her left. Across from it was a small building she couldn't identify, and beyond that the land opened up, scrub grass and hard pan and the distant shapes of ridgelines. She stood there and looked at it and tried to think practically. 4 days, $38. She could rent a room at the hotel for probably $1 a night, which was $4 she couldn't get back. She could eat at the saloon, which would cost her more. She could try to find work, which no one in this town was going to offer her inside of 4 days, given that she had just been publicly rejected by one of its more prominent families. She could also simply get back on the coach in 4 days and return to Boston, which was 3 days' travel east and where she had nothing. Her sister's spare room. The possibility of the same teaching position she'd left, if Miss Hargrove hadn't already filled it. A city that was perfectly good, and that she had left because she was 31 years old and tired of it, and wanted something different, something real, something that was hers. That's a heavy expression for someone who's only been here 20 minutes. The voice came from her left. A man was standing outside the livery stable, leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed, watching her. He was maybe 38, 40, solidly built in the way of men who work outdoors. Not thick exactly, but dense, like the weight was structural. He wore a plain cotton shirt, no jacket, and his hat was the functional kind that didn't make any claims. He had a lean face with a few days of dark stubble and eyes that were the color of creek water, some mixture of gray and green that shifted with the light. He wasn't smiling. He also wasn't pitying her, and that was the thing she noticed. I'm working through my options, Clara said. How many have you got? Fewer than I'd like. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. Garrett Boone, he said. I run a spread about 4 miles east. Clara Whitmore. I know who you are. He didn't say it unkindly. Iron Hollow's small. News moves fast. He uncrossed his arms and straightened up from the fence post. I came in for feed and ended up watching the whole thing. Wasn't meaning to. Most people don't mean to watch things like that, Clara said. They do anyway. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. Fair point. She turned back to the landscape ahead of her. The ridgelines were purple in the afternoon light, beautiful in the way that stark things are beautiful when you're too tired to defend yourself against them. "What kind of work does your spread need?" she asked. A pause. "You asking?" "I'm asking what it needs." "Not offering yet." Another pause, longer this time. She heard him shifting his weight, the creak of the fence post. "House needs managing. The woman who kept it died 2 years back. I've been keeping it passable, but that's about the most accurate word for it. Passable." "Cooking?" "Some. Animals in the morning. The garden's gone to weeds, mostly." "Wages?" $8 a month, room and board. 10 and I fix the garden for real, not just the weeds." He was quiet for a moment. 9 and you don't tell me how to run the ranch." 9 and I don't tell you how to run the ranch," she agreed. She turned to look at him then, and he looked back at her, and there was nothing romantic in it, nothing easy. It was the look of two people trying to take an accurate measure of each other before entering into an arrangement neither of them had planned on. "When do you need an answer?" she asked. "Tonight's fine. I'm staying at the hotel. I can come find you." "I'll find you," Clara said. "I'd rather walk around than sit still right now." He nodded and picked up the feed sacks he'd set down by the stable door. "Hotel dining room at 7. If you decide yes, I leave at 8 tomorrow morning." "All right." He carried the sacks toward his wagon without looking back. She watched him go and then turned back to the ridgelines and the scrub grass and the wide open land that was going to be either a dead end or a beginning, and she genuinely didn't know which. She took dinner alone at the saloon because she couldn't face the hotel dining room in Margaret Aldridge's territory, and she ate a plate of beans and cornbread that was better than it looked and worse than she needed, and she drank 1 cup of coffee that was mostly chicory, and she thought carefully. Boston had been safe. Safe and small and slowly suffocating. She had spent 7 years in the same teaching position, in the same rented room 2 blocks from the school, eating the same breakfast of toast and whatever jam she could afford that week, and watching from a distance while other people's lives went somewhere. She was not unhappy in any dramatic sense. She simply felt, with increasing intensity, that she was waiting for something that was not going to arrive by waiting. The letter exchange with Thomas Aldridge had started through a correspondence club, a polite operation for frontier settlers seeking domestic arrangements and Eastern women seeking opportunities. She had written the first letter with no particular expectation. The second letter had surprised her with its warmth. By the fourth, she had allowed herself to want it, and that was perhaps the mistake, not the wanting itself, but the allowing. The dropping of the guard she'd kept up for 31 years because it was always safer to not quite believe in good things until they were undeniable. Well, now she had the frontier and $9 a month and a man named Garrett Boone who had offered her work without pity, which was the most she had to work with. She could go back to Boston. She could sit in her sister's house and hear the words, "I told you," so constructed out of careful silences and meaningful looks for the rest of the winter. She could reclaim her teaching position if Miss Hargrove hadn't filled it, and spend another 7 years waiting at the same breakfast table for the same toast. Or she could stay. The decision, when she stopped arguing with herself about it, was not actually difficult. She had come this far because she wanted something different. The thing she'd come for was gone, but the different was still available. It just looked different than she'd planned. She met Garrett Boone in the hotel dining room at 7 as agreed. She told him yes. He said, "Good, 8 o'clock, and don't pack anything you can't carry in that bag." She said that was all she had. He nodded and went back to his meal. She slept badly on the hotel's thin mattress, with the sounds of the saloon 2 buildings over filtering through the wall. At some point in the middle of the night, she heard women's voices in the corridor. She couldn't make out the words. And then a door closing, and then silence. She lay on her back and watched the ceiling and thought about the look on Thomas Aldridge's face when his mother had spoken. Not surprise. Resignation. As though he'd been expecting it, as though he'd brought her here already knowing this might happen, and hadn't known how to warn her because warning her would have meant acknowledging his mother's authority over his own choices. She felt sorry for him. Briefly, genuinely. And then she moved on, because he was not her problem. At 7:30, she washed her face, shook out her dress, and repacked her travel bag. She came downstairs to find the lobby empty except for the clerk, who looked at her with an expression somewhere between curiosity and guilt, that told her he had repeated last afternoon's scene to everyone who'd asked. The stagecoach office was closed. The general store wasn't open yet. The street was quiet in the gray early light, the kind of quiet that feels temporary, like the town is holding its breath before the day begins. Garrett Boone's wagon was waiting at the livery stable. His horse, a solid roan, heavier than a riding horse, hitched and patient. He was checking the wheel hitch when she arrived, running his hand along the spokes in the methodical way of a man who doesn't trust things he hasn't checked himself. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning." He finished with the wheel and straightened. "There's space in the back if you want to put your bag up there." She did. He climbed into the seat, and she climbed up beside him. And they pulled out of Iron Hollow at 8:05 without ceremony. She did not look back at the hotel. She looked forward, down the road east, at the country opening up around them, the scrub grass and the rocky outcrops, and the pale sky above it all, enormous and indifferent and full of light. The road to Garrett's ranch was 4 miles of hardpan track that curved east and then northeast through a shallow valley before climbing a low rise and opening onto a wide flat with a view that went on for miles in every direction. The house sat in the center of it, a 2-story timber frame, solid but weathered, with a front porch that sagged slightly at one corner and a barn behind it in considerably better repair than the house. There were outbuildings, a smokehouse, what had once been a kitchen garden, now mostly gone, a corral with 4 horses and a mule. 2 ranch hands were visible in the yard, one mucking out the barn, the other repairing something on the fence line, and they both stopped to watch the wagon come in. "That's Miguel," Garrett said, nodding toward the barn. "And that's Pete at the fence. They're good men. They'll leave you alone." "Will they listen to me in the house?" He glanced sideways at her. "That's your domain. If you've got house business, they'll do what you say." "All right." The house up close was worse than it looked from the road. The sagging porch was one problem. The floorboards had gone soft, and 2 of them were genuinely dangerous. But the interior was the larger issue. The main room was functional but joyless. A plank table, 4 chairs, a cast iron stove that had seen heavy use and not much cleaning, a dry sink that was adequate, shelves along one wall with a bare minimum of stores on them. It smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sour she couldn't identify until she tracked it to a corner where a rag had been left damp and not dealt with. The windows were single pane and small, and the light they let in was thin and yellow. The upper floor had 3 rooms. One was clearly Garrett's, she didn't go in, and one was being used for storage. The third was small and plain with a rope bed frame and a thin mattress and a single window facing east that let in the morning light. It was not a nice room, it was a functional room. Clara set her bag on the mattress and looked at the walls and made a mental list. She came back downstairs to find Garrett standing in the kitchen area with his hat in his hands, which seemed to be a habit of his when he was uncertain about something. I know it's not much," he said. "It's enough to start with." She said it practically, not charitably. "I'm going to need a list of what's in the stores, and I need to know what's broken on that porch before someone goes through it." He blinked. "The 3rd board from the door and both boards on the left side." "All right, I'll go around them until they're fixed. Can Miguel or Pete do carpentry?" "Pete, fair hand with it." "Ask him when he has time. No rush on the porch, but it should happen." She moved to the dry sink and opened the cabinet beneath it. "Do you eat the same things every week, or does it vary?" "It varies based on what Miguel hunts and what I can get in town." "When do you go to town?" "Saturdays, usually, sometimes Wednesdays." "All right." She straightened and turned to face him. "I'm going to get the kitchen in order today. I'll have something on the table by midday. If you need anything specific before Saturday, I'll give you a list." He nodded. He was still holding his hat. "Miss Whitmore?" "Clara is fine." "Clara." He said it like he was deciding whether it fit. "My wife managed this house for 11 years before she passed. I'm not, He stopped. Started again. "I'm not expecting it to be what it was. I know it can't be." "I'm not trying to restore anything," Clara said. "I'm just keeping a house." Something in him seemed to settle, a small releasing. "That's fine then." "Good." She turned back to the cabinet. "Go do your work. I'll do mine." The first week was orientation mostly, learning the rhythms of the place. When Garrett rose, before light always, When the hands came in for the midday meal, Miguel reliable, Pete sometimes late, what was in the root cellar versus what was in the pantry, what the stove's temperament was, what the garden might still be salvageable versus what was truly gone. The stove had moods. It burned hot on the left side and barely warm on the right, which meant anything you were cooking needed to be moved regularly or it would finish uneven. She figured this out on the second morning when she burned a pan of biscuits on one edge while the other edge was still raw. She threw the pan out and started over and adjusted her position. The garden was mostly gone, but not entirely. There were onion volunteers coming up in one bed where the onions had gone to seed, and the herb patch had oregano and thyme that had survived winter on their own, woody but alive. The rest was weeds and hardpan and 2 raised beds whose wood had rotted in place. She pulled the weeds by hand over the course of 4 afternoons and let the soil breathe. On the 5th day, she found a small room off the kitchen that Garrett seemed to have forgotten about. It appeared to be a former larder, roughly 8 by 8, with empty shelves along 3 walls and a ventilation gap near the ceiling. She swept it and put her cleaning supplies in there and felt unreasonably pleased about it. Garrett ate what she cooked without comment, which she took as a baseline endorsement. He was not a demonstrative man. He said, "Please and thank you," and once, on the 4th evening when she'd made a beef stew with the dried herbs from the garden and some root vegetables from the cellar, he said, "That's good in a quiet way that managed to carry more weight than a longer compliment would have." Miguel said thank you every single meal, every single time, with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who had been eating campfire food for too long. Pete said nothing, which she understood was not unfriendliness, but simply Pete. On Saturday, Garrett went into town for supplies. She gave him a list. She did not go with him. When he came back, he dropped a small bundle on the kitchen table that turned out to be 2 packets of garden seeds, tomatoes and summer squash, and a small jar of the good coffee, not the chicory blend the general store usually stocked. "Figured you might need those," he said, and went out to tend to the horse. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment and looked at the seeds and the coffee and felt something that was somewhere between gratitude and grief, because kindness from an unexpected direction is always a complicated thing to receive. Then she put the seeds aside for spring and opened the coffee jar and breathed in the smell and went back to work. She went into town for the first time on the following Wednesday, walking the 4 miles because Garrett had work, and she didn't want to ask. She'd planned to go to the general store for thread and be done with it. What she hadn't planned for was running into Edna Marsh. Edna Marsh was somewhere in her late 40s, with a solid build and a face that moved a lot when she talked. And she was the wife of the man who ran the land office, which made her part of the small tier of Iron Hollow's respectable society. She was standing outside the general store when Clara arrived, and she made no move to get out of the way. "Well," Edna said. "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Marsh," Clara said, because she'd learned names quickly, and it was an advantage she intended to use. "Excuse me. You're working for Garrett Boone now, I've heard." "I keep his house." "Yes." Edna's expression managed to be both sympathetic and cutting at the same time, which was a particular social skill. "It's kind of him, of course. Garrett always was a charitable man after everything with Helen." She paused for effect. "Well, I imagine he needed the help." Clara looked at her. "He hired me because the house needed managing. I'm a capable housekeeper. I don't think charity was part of his reasoning." "Of course." The tone said of course it wasn't, dear. "Excuse me," Clara said again, and went into the store. She got her thread and came back out, and Edna Marsh was still there, now talking to a woman Clara didn't know, who looked at Clara with the frank curiosity of someone watching a zoo exhibit. Clara nodded to them both and walked back the way she'd come. She made the 4 miles home in just over an hour, walking fast, and she was 3/4 of the way there before she realized she'd been clenching her jaw for the last mile and made herself stop. At the house, Garrett was on the porch reattaching a shutter hinge. He glanced at her as she came up the path. "How was town?" "I got the thread?" He looked at her for a moment longer. "Run into someone?" "Edna Marsh." Something crossed his face that was almost dry humor. "She's a piece of work." "She implied you hired me out of charity." "I hired you because my kitchen smelled like something died in it, and I was eating beans out of a can 6 nights a week." He turned back to the hinge. "Doesn't sound like charity to me." Clara almost smiled. She didn't quite, but it was close. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She went inside and made dinner and didn't think about Edna Marsh for the rest of the evening, which was a victory of sorts. Iron Hollow did not warm to her quickly. She had not expected it to, but she had perhaps underestimated how specifically and persistently it would remind her of what she was to them. The woman who had come for Thomas Aldridge and been turned away. It was not always cruel. Sometimes it was simply the absence of warmth that read as cold. The way conversations at the general store stopped slightly when she came in and resumed when she left. The way she was not included in the speculation about the new homesteader arriving to the north. The way the Methodist women's group did not invite her to their Wednesday gathering, even though she walked past the church hall on her way to and from the store. She went to town anyway, every Wednesday, sometimes Saturdays. She nodded to people who didn't nod back and said good morning to people who looked past her, and she bought what she needed and went home. There was a practical reason for this. The ranch needed supplies, but it was also something else. Something stubborn, and probably not entirely rational. She had been trained since childhood that the correct response to public embarrassment was to manage your exposure, to reduce the number of times your face reminded people of the embarrassing thing. She had done this all her life, in Boston, in every social situation where she'd stepped wrong and felt the temperature drop. She had made herself smaller. She was not going to do that here. She had decided this somewhere between the hotel and the stagecoach office on her first morning, and she kept deciding it, actively, every Wednesday and every Saturday. It was not comfortable. It was a choice she made over and over again, and it was not particularly noble. It came as much from stubbornness as from principle. But she made it. On her third Wednesday in town, a woman named Ruth Okafor stopped her outside the dry goods to ask about a poultice recipe. Ruth was a heavy-set woman with a direct manner and tired eyes who ran her family's farm 2 miles south of the main road. She was not unkind. She simply didn't have time for anything but practical exchange, and she talked to Clara the way she'd talk to anyone who might have useful information without the social freight of the marsh tier. Clara told her the poultice recipe, mustard seed and flour paste with a linen compress, and Ruth said, "Thank you, that'll do," and went on her way. It was a 3-minute conversation, and nothing about it suggested the beginning of a friendship. But Clara walked home feeling lighter than she had in weeks, because Ruth had spoken to her like a person and not like a cautionary tale. The nights were the hardest part. Days were manageable. There was always something to do, always something broken or dirty or unplanted or uncooked that gave her body and mind a place to put themselves. She had always been better with tasks than with stillness, and the ranch had plenty of tasks. But after dinner, when Garrett went to his desk in the front room to look over whatever papers he was working on, and Miguel and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house settled into its nighttime creaks and silences, she sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low, and she was just herself. She had been good at being alone in Boston. 7 years of it had made her competent. She'd had her books, her school prep work, her sister's visits on Sundays, but that aloneness had been embedded in a city. There was sound and movement and human life all around, even when she was inside her room, and she had never quite noticed how much that cost her nothing until she tried living without it. Here the quiet was genuine. On still nights you could hear the grass. You could hear your own breathing. She read when she had something to read. She'd brought 2 books in her travel bag, which had seemed like enough and proved not to be, and she made do by rereading them slowly and thinking about them more than she normally would. She wrote letters to her sister Eleanor that she kept brief because she knew what Eleanor was going to say, and she wasn't ready to have that argument in ink. She made lists, things that needed doing on the house, things to plant in the garden come spring, things to ask about at the general store. One evening, about 3 weeks in, she came downstairs at 10 o'clock because she couldn't sleep, and found Garrett sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a lamp burning low, doing nothing at all. Just sitting. She stopped in the doorway. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't know you were still up." Couldn't sleep either. She hesitated and then came in and poured herself a cup of water from the pitcher and sat down at the other end of the table, not close enough to intrude. They were quiet for a long moment. "How long since your wife passed?" she asked. She almost didn't ask it, almost turned it back into safe silence. But he had the look of a man sitting with something specific, and she had learned enough about him by now to know that he was not a man who'd flinch at a direct question. 2 years in March. What was her name? Helen. He said it the way you say a name that's become something more than a name, worn smooth by use. I'm sorry, Clara said. It was fast. That's one thing. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She was sick in the fall and gone by February. I kept thinking there'd be more time. Clara nodded. She didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say, and she had learned early in her life that most of what people say in the face of grief is actually said to make themselves feel better about the presence of grief, not to help the person carrying it. The hands stayed on, he said after a moment. I don't know if they would have otherwise. Miguel's been with the place longer than I have, nearly. He knew what it needed. The ranch is in good shape, Clara said. It was true. Whatever chaos the house had fallen into, the land itself was managed carefully. Helen did the house. He wasn't saying it accusatorially, just placing it, locating where the gap was. I didn't know how much of that was invisible work until it wasn't getting done. Most housework is invisible, Clara said. That's the nature of it. You only see it when it stops. He looked at her. That sounds like something you've thought about. 7 years teaching and boarding on my own. You think about it. They sat for another few minutes in the kind of quiet that had gone from uncomfortable to simply present, and then they both went back to bed. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been established. But in the morning, Garrett said good morning when he came down for coffee, and she said it back, and it felt slightly more like two people in the same house, and slightly less like a business arrangement conducted in parallel. Spring arrived in a way that felt personal on the frontier. Not gradually, the way it felt in Boston with its slow warmings and first flowers, but in a single decisive week where the sky changed color and the ground changed smell, and the whole world seemed to simply decide it was done being winter. Clara planted the tomatoes and the squash. She bought onion sets at the general store and transplanted the oregano to a more sheltered position and put in a row of beans along the south wall of the house where they'd get afternoon sun. Miguel helped her turn the beds one morning without being asked, bringing over a wheelbarrow of aged manure from the barn and working beside her for 2 hours, quiet and efficient. When they finished, he looked at the planted rows and said, Mi mama grew tomatoes in a way that wasn't quite a conversation, but wasn't nothing either. Did she grow them like this? Clara asked. More crowded, he said. She put them everywhere. I might do that later, Clara said, once I see what takes. He nodded and went back to the barn. The garden began to grow, slowly, tentatively, the way things grow when they're not certain they're welcome. Then all at once, the way things grow when they decide they are. She was at the general store on a Wednesday afternoon in late April when she first heard the name. She was at the back of the store, looking at the canned goods, and 2 women near the front were talking in the lowered but not actually quiet voices of people who think they have privacy they don't. Voss asking questions over at the land office, one of them said, asking who's been seen with her. Why would he? Bill says he came in from Cheyenne. Doesn't say why. Just asking about a woman matching her description. Clara stood very still. Which woman? That Whitmore woman, the one who's staying out at the Boone place. She put the can of tomatoes she was holding back on the shelf and walked to the front of the store, and the 2 women stopped talking as she came close. She paid for her flour and her thread and her coffee, and she walked out. The name meant nothing to her. Voss. She turned it over. It meant nothing. And then it meant something. It meant something old and heavy and cold, and she walked the 4 miles home in the low afternoon sun with the weight of it sitting between her shoulder blades, trying to decide whether she was afraid or whether she was simply done being surprised by the past. She was still deciding when she reached the ranch, and when Garrett looked up from the fence post he was setting and saw her face. He didn't ask what was wrong right away. He just watched her until she was ready. She set her bag down on the porch steps. There's something I should probably tell you, she said. He set down his tools and came over and sat on the porch rail. All right. It's about why I left Boston, she said, and why... She stopped. It's complicated. I've got time, he said. She sat down on the porch steps. The evening was coming in from the east, purple and gold over the ridgelines. The horses were quiet in the corral. Somewhere in the barn, Miguel was singing something low in Spanish that she'd come to recognize as his end-of-day habit. She looked out at the land that was not hers and thought about what it would cost her to tell the truth. His name is Cade Voss, she said, and I thought I was done with him. Garrett said nothing. He waited. She started at the beginning. The story she told him was not a short one, and she told it without looking at him for most of it, her eyes on the ridgelines while the light went out of the sky by degrees. Cade Voss had not been a violent man when she first knew him. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the thing that made the rest of it harder to explain. Not because it excused anything, but because it was true, and the truth of it had confused her for years. He had been charming in the particular way of men who are very good at reading a room. He'd understood what people wanted from him, and he'd given it to them with apparent ease. And Clara, who had spent her adult life in a city that was mostly indifferent to her, had found that quality disorienting in the way of suddenly being warm after a long cold. She had met him through her school. He was on the board of a charitable organization that occasionally funded supplies for underfunded classrooms, and he had come to the school one afternoon to deliver a donation and had asked her 3 questions about her students in a row and actually listened to the answers, which was more sustained attention than most people gave her in a week. She was not naive. She knew that by the time she was telling Garrett this, leaning against the porch rail of a stranger's house in the dark, while crickets started up in the grass, he was not going to be able to explain it without sounding naive. But she had been 30 years old and alone, and Cade Voss had paid attention to her, and that had been enough. For the first several months, he had been exactly what he appeared to be. Thoughtful, generous with his time, interested in her opinions on things. He took her to dinner twice, which in Boston meant something, and he wrote her 3 letters when he traveled for his organization's business. And the letters were good. Not formal, not stiff. The letters of a man who was trying to show her who he was. The shift had been so gradual, she hadn't felt it happening. It started with small things, she said. The porch boards were rough under her palms, and she pressed them there, feeling the grain. He'd have a preference about where I should be when he came to call, then a preference about which of my friends I should spend time with. Then suggestions, he called them, about how I presented myself, my clothes, my hair. Did you push back? Garrett asked. The first time, yes. He apologized and said he'd spoken out of turn. She paused. He was very good at apologizing, at first. What she was not going to tell Garrett, not yet, possibly not ever, was how long she had stayed. 8 months after the point when she had begun to understand that something was wrong, she was still there. She had reason to stay. The relationship was not, by that point, one she could leave cleanly, because Cade had made himself relevant to her life in ways that were not accidental. He knew her landlord. He sat on the school board that employed her. He was friendly with her sister Eleanor's husband in a way that made family dinners complicated. None of these were chains exactly. He had never said you can't leave. He had simply made the walls high enough that leaving required a different kind of effort than staying. When I did leave, Clara said, I left badly. I told him in a letter, and I was out of my rooms in 2 days, and I stayed with a friend he didn't know about until I got the correspondence position. He followed you? No, not then. I think he was surprised. I don't think he expected me to actually go. She turned her hands over in her lap. There were letters, 3 of them, over 4 months. The first 2 were the apology version. The third was different. She didn't tell Garrett what the 3rd letter said. She had burned it. But she remembered it clearly enough that the memory still had weight, still sat in her chest wrong when she let herself recall it. That was 8 months ago, she said. I thought the distance would be enough. I thought if I went far enough. People who think they own something don't care about distance, Garrett said. His voice was even, not angry, but there was something flat in it, a recognition she hadn't expected. She looked at him for the first time in a while. You sound like you know the type. I've seen it. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. This Voss? What does he do? His work. He's an investor, he called it. Land, mostly. He had interests in several properties in Massachusetts and Connecticut. He moved money through his organization as charitable work, but the charitable work was... She stopped. I'm not sure how legal most of it was. I was deliberately incurious because it was easier. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He's got money then. Yes. And he's asking about you at the land office. That's what I heard. Garrett leaned his forearms on his knees and looked out at the dark yard. The barn was quiet now. Miguel's singing had stopped. What does he want? I don't know exactly. In the letter, she caught herself. He has a particular way of thinking about people that doesn't allow for them to leave. When something of his goes somewhere without his permission, he goes and finds it. You're not something of his. I know that. Does he? She exhaled. Probably not. The night had fully arrived by now. The sky was enormous and dark, and overhead, the stars had come out in the way they did out here, with a density and completeness that Boston's gaslit sky never allowed for. She had noticed this when she first arrived and had not gotten used to it. I should have told you before, Clara said, before you hired me. You should have known who you were taking on. Garrett considered this. Probably, he said, but I don't know that it would have changed anything. She wasn't sure if that was reassuring or simply honest. With him, they were often the same thing. You can sleep on it, she said. If you want me gone in the morning, Clara. He said her name the way you stop an argument that doesn't need to go where it's heading. Go to sleep. She went inside. She lay on her rope bed for a long time, listening to the settling sounds of the house, and she thought about Cade Voss in Iron Hollow, in that dusty, small-windowed land office, asking about her, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt angry, not afraid. Not first, anyway. Angry. He had followed her 2,000 miles and walked into her new life wearing the same confidence he'd walked into everything else, and the anger was clean and specific in a way fear wasn't. She held on to that. Eventually, she slept. Garrett said nothing about Voss at breakfast the next morning, and nothing about him the morning after that, and Clara took this as his answer and moved on. She asked Pete to fix the porch boards. He came around on a Saturday afternoon and replaced the soft ones and reinforced two others that were heading in the same direction. And when he finished, she brought him a cup of coffee, and he drank it in 3 swallows and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She repainted the dry sink cabinet with a tin of white paint she found in the larder. She got the garden beds properly squared using salvaged lumber Miguel found in the barn, and she replanted the herb patch with some new starts she bought at the general store. She went to town on Wednesdays and Saturdays. She kept going. She talked to Ruth Okafor twice more, once about the poultice results, it had worked, and once about a pest problem Ruth was having with her bean rows. She suggested copper rings at the bases, a trick she'd read about in a gardening circular and hadn't personally tested, but Ruth said she'd try it. A man named John Prater at the hardware counter started saying good morning back to her around the 5th or 6th time she said it to him, which felt like a small diplomatic achievement. She did not see Edna Marsh again for 3 weeks, and then she saw her twice in 4 days, which seemed like the universe testing something. The first time, Edna was with Margaret Aldridge, and both women looked at Clara with the particular synchronized blankness of a coordinated social cut. Clara said good morning to the air between their heads and went into the general store. The second time, Edna was alone and appeared to be having a difficult conversation with her own hat. She was standing outside the hotel studying a tear in the brim with the expression of someone reassessing a life decision. Clara walked past her and then stopped. It was an impulse. She frequently distrusted her impulses, but this one had its own momentum. Cotton batting and a small square of grosgrain, Clara said. If the tear is structural, if it's just the surface fabric, you can use a ladder stitch. Edna looked up at her. What? The hat, Clara said. The damage on the brim. Edna looked at her hat and then at Clara with the expression of someone who is being offered something suspicious. I know how to mend a hat. Of course, Clara said, and kept walking. That evening at dinner, she thought about it and concluded she was possibly losing her mind, but also that it had felt like the right move in the moment, which was about as much justification as most things ever had. In June, the tomatoes came in. Not spectacularly. This was their first season, and she'd put them in late. But enough. Enough for a sauce one evening that Miguel ate with the focused appreciation of someone reactivating a memory. Enough for a small dish she left on the table one afternoon when Thomas Aldridge's mother, of all people, walked up the ranch road on some errand related to a property boundary dispute that apparently involved Garrett's fence line. Margaret Aldridge had not changed since the afternoon at the stagecoach landing. She walked with the same posture, wore the same expression of appraising judgment, and came to the door and knocked with the authority of someone who expects doors to open for them. Clara opened the door. They regarded each other. Mrs. Aldridge, Clara said. Miss Whitmore. A pause, precisely calibrated. Is Mr. Boone available? He's out at the east fence. I can send Miguel. If you would. Come in out of the heat, Clara said. Because it was 91 degrees and whatever else Margaret Aldridge was, she was not young, and standing her on the porch in the sun for 20 minutes was petty in a way Clara didn't want to be. Margaret came inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at the room with the trained eye of someone assessing a domestic situation. She looked at the white-painted cabinet and the garden through the window and the bunch of herbs drying from a nail above the dry sink. "You've done work here," she said. Not a compliment exactly, an observation. It needed it. Helen kept it beautifully. She said this and watched Clara's face, the way you test a surface to see what's underneath. "I know," Clara said. "I heard she was a remarkable woman." This appeared to mildly disarm Margaret Aldridge, who had been expecting a different response. She said nothing for a moment. Clara poured her a glass of water without being asked and set it on the table. Margaret sat, because the heat was real, and she was 60 years old and the water was there. "My son made his decision," Margaret said eventually. It had the quality of something she'd been holding that she'd decided to set down. Not an apology. Not close to one. But something. "His decision to make," Clara said. "You don't seem—" Margaret stopped, reconsidered. "You don't seem particularly affected." "I was, at the time," Clara said. "I'm less so now. This is what you wanted? Keeping a rancher's house? This is what I have. I find I can work with it." Garrett came in 40 minutes later, muddy from the fence line, and conducted his property business with Margaret at the kitchen table while Clara made cornbread and kept out of it. When Margaret left, Garrett stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene, the 2 glasses of water, the chairs at the table, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "She sit with you?" he asked. "For a while. That's something." He went to wash his hands. "She doesn't sit with people she doesn't respect, even a little." Clara didn't know what to do with that, so she put it aside and brought the cornbread to the table. But the trouble with Cade Voss did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way certain kinds of trouble do. In increments, each one plausibly deniable, each one leaving a small cold residue that accumulated over time. The first increment was a man she didn't recognize, sitting outside the saloon when she walked past it on a Wednesday morning. He was unremarkable in his appearance. Brown hat, nondescript coat, the kind of face that didn't ask to be remembered. But he watched her walk past with the specific quality of attention of someone who already knows who you are. She filed it away and kept walking. The second increment was a question John Prater at the hardware counter mentioned offhandedly 2 weeks later. "Some fellow in here last week asking if you worked out at the Boone place." He said it conversationally, the way you'd mention a mild curiosity. "Didn't know him, just passing through," he said. "What did he look like?" Clara asked. John described the man outside the saloon. "More or less. Brown hat, nondescript coat." "What did you tell him?" "Said I didn't know your business." John shrugged. "Didn't see why it was his." She thanked him and went back to the ranch and told Garrett that evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How long has it been since you left Boston?" 8 months. He nodded slowly. "He's patient." "Yes," she said. "He always was." What she didn't say, and what she was working out as she said the parts she did say, was that Cade Voss's patience had never actually been patience in the generous sense of the word. It was more like the patience of something that has decided it will have what it wants eventually, and time is an inconvenience rather than an obstacle. She went to bed that night with the lamp burning later than usual, and she read her book, and she could not have told you a single word of it in the morning. Pamane. Pan. Garrett started driving her to town in July. He didn't make an announcement about it. He simply appeared one Wednesday morning with the wagon hitched, heading in for supplies, and said, "Climb up if you're going," and she climbed up. It happened again the following Saturday, and the one after that, and she understood that this was how he communicated certain things, not by saying them, but by doing them in a way that made the intention clear without requiring either of them to acknowledge it directly. She appreciated this more than she could have explained. In town, they moved in parallel. He went to the feed store and the hardware, and she went to the general store and sometimes the dry goods, and they met at the wagon afterward. It was not conspicuous. It did not need to be. What she noticed over these weeks was how the town oriented itself slightly differently when Garrett was in it. He was not a prominent man in the way of Thomas Aldridge's family, who had money and position, but he was a known quantity in the particular way of someone who has been reliable for a long time. People nodded to him with a quality of nod that meant something. Bill Marsh at the land office came out to the street to say something to him once, a 3-minute conversation that looked easy and mutual in a way Bill Marsh's conversations with Clara never did. The men at the hardware store talked to him like a peer, which he was. She was aware that being seen with him changed some small calculation in Iron Hollow's estimation of her, and she was aware that she was using that, and she was not particularly proud of needing to use it, but she was pragmatic enough to use it anyway. Something else was changing too, slower and harder to name. The easy hostility of the first month had given way to something more complicated. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of suspended judgment. A town that had been certain it knew what she was and was becoming slightly less certain. She saw it in the way John Prater's good morning had spread, incrementally, to the woman who ran the dry goods. In the way Mrs. Calloway from the bank's wife had asked her, tentatively, about her herb garden and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. In the way Edna Marsh, of all people, had started saying good morning back. None of it was transformation. It was something smaller and more real than transformation. A slight thawing, the degree-by-degree kind, that could reverse at any time. Ruth Okafor became the closest thing she had to a friend, if friend was the right word. They were not confiding women, either of them. They were both practical and private, and somewhat allergic to the social performances required by friendship in its formal sense. But they talked at the general store and sometimes outside it, and the conversations had gone from 3 minutes to 15, and Ruth had started asking Clara's opinion on agricultural questions with the straightforward acknowledgement that Clara didn't know as much about frontier farming as Ruth did, but sometimes thought of things Ruth hadn't. "You read a lot," Ruth said one afternoon, not as a compliment, but as an explanatory observation. "I do," Clara said. "Keep reading, then. Some of it sticks." That was Ruth's version of generous, and Clara received it as such. Listen. In late July, Cade Voss came himself. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw the rider on the road from town. There was nothing remarkable about a rider on the road. The road went on past the ranch to other properties further east. But she stopped what she was doing and watched, because something in the quality of the movement made her stomach go wrong before she consciously knew why. He rode better than he used to. He'd always been competent on a horse, but now he rode like a man who'd spent months in open country, sitting easy in the saddle. He was wearing frontier clothes, canvas trousers, a good coat, a hat she'd never seen on him. But the way he wore them was still the way of a city man wearing a costume, not quite natural. He turned in at the gate. She set down the laundry and walked to the front of the house, and he pulled up on the path about 10 yards from her and looked at her with an expression she knew well and had not missed. He looked satisfied, like something had been found. "Clara." He said her name with the warmth he did everything, which was its own kind of warning. "Cade." Her voice was flat. He dismounted. He was still handsome, she noticed distantly. That had not been the problem, had never been the problem. He was 41 and well-maintained, and he wore the kind of ease that men who have always had enough money wear without knowing they're wearing it. "You went a long way," he said. "I meant to." "I know." He looked at the house, then at the barn, then back at her. "Is this where you've landed?" "It is." "As a housekeeper." She didn't bother with it. "What do you want, Cade?" He walked his horse to the fence post and tied it there, unhurried, the way he did everything. "To talk." "We don't have anything to talk about." "I think we do." "Then you're wrong." He turned and looked at her with the patient quality she'd described to Garrett. Not aggressive, not yet, but definite. The look of a man who has decided the conversation will happen on his terms, regardless of the other party's preference. "Clara." She said no to the conversation. Garrett's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him come up, but he was there, at the corner of the house, and he'd stopped about 6 feet away from her with his arms loose at his sides and his eyes on Voss with a quality of attention that was not unfriendly in its surface and was not friendly in anything underneath. Voss looked at him, recalibrated. "You'd be Mr. Boone." "I would. I'm an old acquaintance of Miss Whitmore's, just stopping to say hello." She said hello, Garrett said, and then she said no to the rest of it. That seems about settled to me. A long pause. Voss looked at Clara with something that was trying to look like hurt feelings and was actually closer to assessment. Clara, I came a long way. I know, she said. Go back. Go? He held her eyes for 3 seconds. She counted, and then he untied his horse and mounted and turned down the path without another word. He did not look back. Clara watched him until the road curved and he was gone from sight. Garrett came and stood beside her, not close, not touching. That him? He said. That's him. He won't stop, Garrett said. It was not a question. No, she said. He won't. She was right about that. He came back 3 days later, this time while Garrett was in the east pasture and she was alone at the house. He knocked on the front door, which she didn't open. He talked through the door for several minutes, starting with reasonable-sounding language about misunderstandings and fresh starts and ending, when she said nothing, with something that wasn't quite a threat and was nothing else either. You don't belong out here, Clara. This place isn't yours. These people aren't your people. I'm the only thing that makes sense for you. She said nothing. She heard him stand on the porch for another minute, the boards settling under his weight. Then he left. That evening she told Garrett about it, and she watched his jaw tighten in the small, specific ways she'd come to recognize as his version of anger, which he kept close and didn't perform. I'm going to need you to hear me out, she said, and not go looking for him. Clara, I mean it. If you go after him, he uses that. He'll go to the marshal and say you threatened him, and it becomes the story of a man protecting his unwanted employee, which is the story he wants. Garrett looked at her. And what story do you want? I want the story where he decides it's not worth it and goes home, she said. I know that's probably not realistic, but that's what I want. So we wait. We wait and we don't give him ammunition. He did not love this. She could see it in the line of his shoulders, the particular way he sat with both hands on the kitchen table like he was keeping them occupied. But he nodded. All right, he said. The third time Voss came, he had a man with him. This was July, and the heat was serious, the kind that pressed down on the land from mid-morning until late afternoon and made everything slow and deliberate. Clara was in the garden when she heard the horses, and she straightened and turned and saw them coming up the road. Voss on his good horse, and beside him someone she didn't know, heavier, older, with the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors or had in some previous life. She walked to the front of the house. Garrett was at the barn. She could see him there, and she could see the moment he registered the 2 riders and walked out to the yard. Voss pulled up. He looked at her and then at Garrett and spoke to Garrett. Mr. Boone, I want to have a conversation about the woman you've taken on here. Garrett walked out from the barn at a steady pace, not fast. You can talk to her directly. I'd rather talk to you, man to man. The phrase landed with the full weight of its intention. Clara watched Garrett register it, watched him decide something. Man to man, Garrett repeated it back flatly. She's standing right there. She can hear whatever you want to say. Voss looked at her. He had shifted, she noticed, from the charming mode he'd been using at the door to something else, something that showed more of the infrastructure underneath. Clara is under a misapprehension about her situation. She left a stable arrangement to come out here on a scheme that fell through, and now this isn't the life for her. She knows that. I'm offering her a way home. I'm home, Clara said. A pause. This ranch isn't yours. It's where I work and sleep, and it's where I've decided to be, she said. That's enough for now. Clara. Cade. She kept her voice level. She had to work to keep it level, but she did it. Whatever you think this is, whatever claim you think you have on me, you don't have it. You haven't had it since January. I've been clear about that. January was a mistake, he said, and now the warmth was gone from his voice, not replaced by anger, but by something colder and more patient. You made a decision in a difficult moment. You didn't think it through. I thought it through every day for 8 months before January, she said, and every day since. The man beside him shifted in the saddle. He hadn't spoken yet. He was the kind of man who didn't need to. Garrett said, You've said your piece and she's answered. Time to go. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at Clara, and his expression did something she recognized. A kind of settling, a decision made. I'll be in Iron Hollow, he said. when you change your mind. I won't change my mind. He turned his horse and left, and his man followed without looking back. Clara stood in the yard after they were gone and felt the heat of the afternoon pressing down and realized her hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, from the particular effort of holding yourself completely still when every part of you wants to do something. And she had done that. She had been still and correct and clear, and she thought that was probably right. She thought that was probably the correct thing. "Clara," Garrett said. She turned to him. His expression had the careful quality it got when he was deciding how much of himself to show. "You did right," he said, staying calm, not giving him anything. "I don't feel calm." "I know, but you looked it," she exhaled. "He's not going to leave." "No," Garrett said. "He's not." He looked toward the road where Voss had gone. "He brought that man for a reason. He wanted us to see him. Wanted us to understand the implication." "Yes." She looked at Garrett. "Are you frightened?" He considered this seriously, which was how he considered everything. "Not frightened," he said, "but I'm taking him serious," which is probably what he wants. "What he wants," she said slowly, "is for me to decide this isn't worth it. For me to decide that whatever I've built here, whatever little I've built, isn't worth the trouble he's willing to make." "Is it?" Garrett asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She looked at the house, the porch with its new boards, the garden with the tomatoes and the squash and the oregano and the beans in their rows, the barn, solid and red in the afternoon light, Miguel somewhere inside it, Pete at the east fence, probably, the kitchen with its repainted cabinet and its troublesome stove, and the growing stack of weeks she'd spent learning its moods. None of it was hers, not legally, not formally. None of it had been given to her, and none of it was guaranteed. "Yes," she said. "It is." Garrett nodded. He looked at the house too, and then at her, and something passed through his expression that she didn't have a name for yet. "Then we figure it out," he said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration. It was simply the truth of where they were, and she took it as such, and she went back inside and started on dinner because there was work to do and the evening was coming, and whatever was going to come next could come in its own time. She was not going to spend the hours between now and then being afraid. Voss did not leave Iron Hollow. He took a room at the hotel, the same hotel where Clara had spent her first night in town, which she suspected was not accidental. And he settled in with the patience she had described to Garrett, and that patience proved to be the most accurate thing she'd ever said about him. He did not come back to the ranch that week or the week after. He simply existed in Iron Hollow, visible and unhurried, and let the fact of his existence do its work. She heard about him through the normal channels of a small town, which was to say through Ruth Okafor, who had no investment in the social politics of the situation and reported what she observed without editorializing. Voss ate at the hotel dining room and tipped well and was polite to everyone and drank moderately at the saloon and was exactly the kind of man a frontier town finds agreeable, which was the point. "He's introducing himself," Clara told Garrett on a Tuesday evening, "building relationships." "What kind of relationships?" "The useful kind. Bill Marsh at the land office, the hotel owner, whoever has influence without being conspicuous about it." Garrett was quiet, turning his coffee cup. "He's making himself a member of the community before the conflict starts. So when it starts, he's already got a position." She had watched this strategy operate before in Boston on a smaller scale. Cade Voss did not threaten people directly if he could help it. He preferred to arrange the landscape so that when he finally made his move, the terrain already favored him. It was very effective, and it was also, she thought, the action of someone who fundamentally did not believe in direct confrontation because direct confrontation had outcomes he couldn't control. She could work with that. She was working with it. She had begun to think about what resources she actually had, cataloging them the way she'd cataloged hours on the stagecoach. Garrett, who was not a demonstrative ally but was a solid one. Miguel, who said little but watched everything and whose loyalty to the ranch ran deeper than his wages. Pete, who was taciturn but competent. Ruth Okafor, who was not a friend in the full sense but was honest and observed things and was not interested in Cade Voss's money. John Prater at the hardware store, who had refused to confirm her whereabouts to Voss's man and seemed to have a principled resistance to people asking questions he found impertinent. It was not an army, but it was something. The thing she could not control, and knew she could not control, was Iron Hollow's broader opinion. The town had been forming its assessment of her for months now. The rejected woman, the Boston housekeeper, the one who kept showing up on Wednesdays despite not being particularly welcome. And that assessment was still in motion, still unsettled. Cade Voss was now also in that calculus, and he was better at social performance than she was. He always had been. She went to town on Wednesday as usual. She said good morning to John Prater and the woman at the dry goods and Edna Marsh, and she bought her flour and her thread and her coffee. She did not go near the hotel. On her way back through the main street, she saw Voss outside the barber shop, talking to a man she didn't recognize. Voss saw her at the same moment, and he did not look away quickly, the way someone caught doing something wrong looks away. He met her eyes and nodded pleasantly, the way you nod to an acquaintance. She nodded back and kept walking. She felt his eyes on her back for half a block. The thing that changed the town's temperature had nothing to do with Voss. It was smaller than that and larger than that, and Clara did not plan it, which perhaps was what made it matter. It was the second week of August. The heat was at its peak, the kind of sustained heat that makes people short-tempered and dogs lay flat in the shade, and the air above the road shimmer in a way that makes distances unreliable. She was in the general store buying salt when she heard the sound from the street. Not a scream exactly, more a shout that had fear in it. A woman's voice, followed by the particular quality of commotion that stops people in their tracks. She came out of the store to find a small crowd gathering at the far end of the block. She moved toward it, the way you move toward the sound of trouble when you're a person who does that, which she apparently was. Eleanor Marsh, Edna's daughter-in-law, she would later learn, a young woman of maybe 23 who had been married to Edna's son for less than a year, was collapsed on the boardwalk outside the dry goods. She was conscious but barely, her skin the color of old milk, her breathing wrong in a way Clara heard from 10 feet away before she reached her. It was high and labored, and there was a wheeze underneath it that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Somebody's gone for the doctor?" Clara asked the crowd. "Doc Hennessy's 2 miles out," a man said. "His wife took sick and he went this morning. Then somebody ride for him, right now." She looked at the man. "You, go." He went. Which surprised her a little, though she didn't have time to think about it. She crouched beside Eleanor Marsh. The young woman looked at her with the particular confusion of someone who is frightened and not entirely present. "Eleanor," Clara said, "can you hear me?" "I can." "Yes." A pause, more difficult breathing. "I can't catch my breath. I was fine and then—" "Don't talk. I'm going to ask you some questions and you nod or shake your head." She put her hand on Eleanor's wrist, finding the pulse, which was rapid and irregular. She looked at the posture, the way Eleanor was holding herself, slightly forward, as if sitting up helped. It did help. Clara had read enough to know what that meant. "Has this happened before?" she asked. Eleanor shook her head. "Any chest pain?" A nod. Small, frightened. "Here." Clara touched the center of her sternum. Another nod. The crowd around them was quiet, with the particular quiet of people who don't know what they're looking at but understand something serious is happening. Someone had materialized with a chair, and Clara helped Eleanor into it. Upright was better than lying down for this. She was almost certain of that. "Someone get me a wet cloth," she said. "Cold water if there is any." A cloth appeared within a minute. She pressed it to the back of Eleanor's neck. Edna Marsh arrived about 90 seconds later, pushing through the crowd with the force of a woman whose social power gives her physical right of way. She stopped when she saw who was crouched beside her daughter-in-law. "What is she doing?" Edna said to the crowd in general. "She's helping," Ruth Okafor said from somewhere behind Clara. Ruth's voice had the quality of a statement rather than an argument. "She's not a doctor. Neither are you, and neither is anyone else who's here," Clara said without looking up. "If you want to take over, tell me what you know about treating heart arrhythmia. If you don't know what that is, let me work." Silence. She felt it, the crowd's stillness, Edna Marsh's contained outrage. "Eleanor," she said, back to the young woman, "I want you to focus on slowing your breathing. In through the nose, slow, don't fight it. Let your shoulders drop." Eleanor tried. Her breathing was still wrong, but it was marginally less panicked, which was something. "How far along are you?" Clara asked quietly. Eleanor looked at her. Something shifted in her face. Surprise, and then relief. The relief of someone who has been trying to hide something and suddenly doesn't have to. 4 months, she whispered. No one knows. It's all right, Clara said. That's all right. She knew from reading, from the particular kind of comprehensive reading you do when you are alone and have good access to a lending library and believe that practical knowledge is its own form of currency, that cardiac stress in early pregnancy could present this way, could come on fast in the heat and resolve with rest and management, or could be more serious. She did not know which this was. What she knew was that Eleanor needed to stay upright, stay calm, stay cool, and not panic further. And she knew the fastest way to achieve that was to be calm herself, which she was. Doc Hennessy arrived 35 minutes later on a horse that was breathing almost as hard as Eleanor. He examined Eleanor right there on the boardwalk, confirmed what Clara had suspected, and said the same things Clara had done were the right things. He looked at Clara once, briefly, with the professional curiosity of someone who has identified an anomaly. You've seen this before? He said. I've read about it, Clara said. He nodded. Reading counts, he said, and turned back to his patient. They moved Eleanor inside the dry goods, which was the nearest building, and Clara stayed until Eleanor's color came back and her breathing steadied, and Edna Marsh, who had also stayed and had been standing at the edge of the room with her hands folded and her expression carefully controlled, finally exhaled. After. When Eleanor was stable and Edna was beside her and the crisis had settled into the manageable category, Edna looked across the room at Clara. She didn't say thank you. The words themselves didn't come. But she held Clara's eyes for 2 full seconds, and she nodded. Once, direct, small, with the quality of a woman who means a thing even if she can't bring herself to say it. Clara nodded back and left. She walked home that afternoon in the full August heat, and she was tired in the deep way that comes from sustained adrenaline spending itself. And she thought about Eleanor Marsh, 23 years old and 4 months pregnant and frightened and now going to be all right. And she thought about the crowd and Edna's face. She was not naive enough to think one afternoon changed everything, but something had shifted. She had been standing in Iron Hollow's street for 6 months, regular as a calendar, and the town had been deciding what to do with her, and today they had seen something they had not been expecting to see. Ruth Okafor was waiting at the end of the ranch road when Clara reached it. She had ridden ahead and was sitting on her horse with the patience of someone who doesn't waste energy. You did right in there, Ruth said. Thank you for saying so. I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true, and I wanted you to know I think so. Clara looked at her. That amounts to the same thing. Maybe, Ruth said, but it's worth knowing when it comes from someone who doesn't say things for the sake of saying them. She gathered her reins. Edna Marsh will talk. She always does. What she says is going to be different now. I hope so. Ruth nodded and turned her horse toward her own place. Clara watched her go and then walked the last quarter mile to the house. Garrett heard the story that evening and was quiet through most of it. 4 months along, he said. Did Edna know? I don't think so. I don't think anyone did. He nodded. He was looking at the table. Eleanor's a quiet sort, keeps to herself. A pause. She all right? Doctor says yes, with rest and keeping out of the heat. Good. He looked at her. You handled that. I did what I knew how to do. That's what handling something is. She got up to clear the plates and he stood to help, which he had started doing sometime in the last month without either of them naming the shift. They moved around the kitchen in the comfortable parallel of people who have learned each other's rhythms, and she thought about what Ruth had said. What she says is going to be different now, and she thought it was probably true. She was also thinking about Voss and what he was going to do when the town's orientation toward her shifted. Patient men, in her experience, did not stay patient when the landscape stopped cooperating. She was right about that. He came to the ranch again on a Thursday afternoon, and this time there were 2 men with him. Not the same man as before, 2 different ones, and these 2 had the specific quality of men who are not there for conversation. They sat their horses just inside the gate, and Voss rode up alone to the house. Clara had seen them coming. She was on the porch, and she had 15 seconds to decide what to do with herself before he pulled up, and she spent those 15 seconds standing very still and making sure her face was correct. Clara, he said. The warmth was gone now, had been gone since the second visit. What remained was the infrastructure, the certainty, the patience, the fundamental conviction that he would eventually have what he was waiting for. I'd like to have a private conversation. What you have to say, you can say in front of Garrett. Garrett isn't here, Voss said. He wasn't. He'd gone to the north pasture that morning and wasn't expected back until late afternoon. She had known that. Voss had also known that, which meant he'd been watching the ranch's patterns with more attention than she'd accounted for, and that information was cold and clear, and she filed it. Then say it in front of me, she said. I'm a sufficient audience. He got down from his horse. She didn't move from the porch. I'm not a patient man by nature, he said. I've been patient here because I thought it was what you needed. Time to understand that what you're doing isn't working, that you're building something on borrowed ground. He looked at the house and then at her, and his eyes were the careful eyes of a man who has thought about what he's going to say and is saying it exactly as planned. The Boone Ranch is mortgaged. Did you know that? That's not your business. It's 3 years behind on a note held by a bank in Cheyenne, Voss said. The bank has been patient because Boone's a reliable type and the land has value. But patience isn't infinite. He paused. I've had conversations with that bank, Clara. I want you to understand that. She stood very still. The two men at the gate were visible in her peripheral vision. The afternoon was hot and windless. That's a threat, she said. It's information. It's a threat and you know it and I know it, so let's not do the part where we call it something else. She held his eyes. You're saying that if I don't come back with you, you'll buy the note and call it. I'm saying the bank has options it hasn't exercised yet, and you've given them reasons to consider their options. He said nothing, which was the same as yes. She thought of Garrett's face in the mornings, the way he handled his coffee cup, always the same mug, the handle slightly chipped, and he always held it with both hands in the winter and one in summer. The north pasture where he'd ridden this morning, the land he'd worked for 11 years, that Helen had lived on for 11 years, that Miguel had worked for longer than that. The beans in the garden that were nearly finished for the season, and the tomatoes that were still coming in, and the second planting of herbs she'd put in along the south wall. Get off this land, she said. Voss blinked. She didn't often surprise him, and for a moment she saw it. The small recalibration. Clara, get off this land, she said again. I'm not coming with you. I'm not leaving. Whatever you do with that bank, that's between you and Garrett will deal with it. But you're not going to use it to move me, and you're not going to stand on this porch and pretend you're giving me information instead of making threats. She took one step toward him, just one. You have never once in our entire acquaintance given me information that was actually for my benefit. I understand that now. I'm sorry it took me as long as it did. Another silence, the kind that has decision in it. Then Voss walked back to his horse. He mounted without rushing, without any visible anger, with the controlled exterior of a man who has more moves available. He looked at her from the saddle. This isn't finished, he said. I know, she said. He turned and rode out, his two men falling in behind him. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and she shook for about 3 minutes, which she had not allowed herself to do on the porch. Her hands were flat on the table, and she watched them tremble, and she thought, all right, there it is, and she breathed until it stopped. Then she got up and started on dinner because Garrett was going to be back in 2 hours, and she needed to tell him about the bank. His face when she told him did not do what she'd been afraid it would do. It did not crumble or collapse. It went very still. 3 years, he said. That's what he said. He's not wrong about the note. He might be wrong about having talked to the bank. He might be, she said, or he might not. Garrett sat with this. He had his coffee, the chipped mug, both hands, though it wasn't cold. After Helen died, the yield wasn't what it needed to be. I've been catching up. I know. How do you know? She met his eyes. I can read a supply ledger. I didn't go looking. They're on the shelf in the front room and they're not private. I wasn't trying to... No. He shook his head. It's not that. He was quiet for a moment. I should have told you, since you're... He stopped. Since you're part of this place now. The words landed simply, without ornament. I am, she said. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and it was not the moment for anything beyond what was being said, and they both seemed to understand that. The bank's in Cheyenne, Garrett said. I can write to them, find out if he's actually made contact. Do that, Clara said. And Garrett, I want to know what we're actually working with. The real number, he told her. It was not as bad as she'd feared and not as good as she'd hoped, and she spent that evening doing arithmetic in her notebook. Not because she had answers, but because having accurate numbers made her feel less at the mercy of Voss's version of reality. August moved into September and the air began to change. Still warm in the afternoons, but with a different quality, an edge that wasn't there before, the first suggestion of what was coming. The garden came to its end of season with a final push of tomatoes and the last of the beans, and Clara put up what she could in the root cellar, more than the year before, because she'd read about canning and had bought jars in town, and had spent 2 weekends in August working through the process with the methodical patience of someone who is not naturally patient but knows when patience is required. Miguel helped her carry the jars to the cellar and counted them and said something in Spanish that she took to be approving. "What does that mean?" she asked. "My mother used to say, una despensa llena es un invierno corto." He thought about it. A full pantry makes a short winter. "Your mother was sensible," Clara said. "She was the most sensible person I have ever known," he agreed, and carried the last crate down. The town continued its slow adjustment. Edna Marsh had talked, as Ruth predicted, and what she'd said had been different than what she would have said in June. Claire did not hear the exact words, but she felt their effect in the way the dry goods woman now made conversation when she came in, and the way Mrs. Calloway stopped her outside the bank to ask how Eleanor was recovering, as though Clara's interest in Eleanor's health was established fact. She was not accepted, not fully, not in the way a woman born here would be accepted. There was still the memory of the stagecoach landing and Margaret Aldridge's voice carrying down the street. But she was something more than she had been, and she moved through the town with a fraction less friction. She did not go to the Methodist women's group. She had not been invited, and she did not invite herself. But Ruth mentioned there was a quilting gathering at her farm on the first Saturday of September, informal, not organized by anyone official, and Clara said she might stop by if she had time. She stopped by. There were 4 women, Ruth, 2 others she knew vaguely from the store, and a young woman she didn't know at all who turned out to be the wife of a homesteader who'd settled 3 miles north. They sat on Ruth's porch and worked and talked about practical things. The harvest, the coming cold, whose well had run low in August. And nobody performed anything at anyone, and Clara sat with them for 2 hours and felt, for the first time since leaving Boston, that she was in the company of people who were simply being themselves around her. It was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. Voss's patience broke in late September. Looking back, she could see the trajectory of it, could see how the shifting temperature of the town and her refusal to move, and Garrett's letter to the bank in Cheyenne that confirmed Voss had indeed made preliminary contact but had not yet taken any formal action, had all accumulated into a pressure that a man of his particular constitution could not hold indefinitely. He had built his position in Iron Hollow carefully. He had the hotel owner, and he had Bill Marsh at the land office, and he had 2 or 3 men whose exact loyalties she couldn't map. He had the implied threat of the banknote, and he had his own money and his own patience. But he did not have the town, and what had happened with Eleanor in August had moved a set of people he couldn't buy with charm or money. Ruth Okafor, John Prater, Doc Hennessy himself, who had asked Clara pointed and specific questions about her medical reading, and had come away from that conversation with an opinion she could feel even when he didn't express it directly. The night he came to the ranch with 4 men, she was asleep. She was not a heavy sleeper, never had been. And she came awake to the sound of horses in the yard at something past midnight. Not the sound of 1 horse or 2, multiple. And the voices that came with them had the low, deliberate quality of men trying to be quiet and not entirely succeeding. She was on her feet and at the window in seconds, and what she saw in the yard below was Voss on his horse, and 4 others fanned out around him in lamplight coming from the barn where Miguel slept, which meant Miguel was awake too. She pulled on her boots and her coat over her nightgown and went into the hallway. Garrett's door was already open. He came out of it with his rifle, and he looked at her with complete alertness. He was one of those men who woke fully and immediately. 5 of them, she said. I saw from the window. He handed her a smaller rifle, a .22, accurate enough at short range. She took it without discussion. Stay back from the windows. I'm not staying back from Clara. His voice was level. "If it comes to it, I need to know where you are. Stay at the top of the stairs unless I call for you." She didn't like it, but she understood the logic, which was that he needed his attention on what was outside and not on tracking her position, and she went to the top of the stairs. She heard him go to the door, heard it open. "Voss?" Garrett's voice from the porch. "Boone." Voss from the yard. "I've come for Clara." "She's not coming. I'd rather you step aside and let her make that choice herself." "She's made that choice several times." A silence. The horses shifted. Clara could hear her own heartbeat. "This ranch is under financial obligation to a bank that is open to new arrangements," Voss said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "I can make that problem disappear. Clara comes with me, the note gets bought and cleared. That's a straightforward transaction, Boone. Nobody has to make this harder than it is." Garrett said nothing for a moment. Clara thought she heard him exhale. "You're offering to buy a woman," Garrett said. "I'm offering a solution to a debt problem." "That's the same thing, and you know it." Another pause. "Clara!" Voss's voice raised, directed at the house now. "Clara, come out here. I want to hear it from you directly. You want to stay on a ranch that's going to be foreclosed in 18 months. You want to—" "She's not going to answer you," Garrett said. Then a sound she hadn't anticipated. Miguel's voice, from the direction of the barn, speaking not to Voss but toward the house. "Miss Clara, I got the shotgun if you need it." She heard Pete's voice from the far side of the yard, location unclear. "Got the other one." She felt something move in her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. Voss was quiet for a moment. She could imagine him counting. 2 men inside the house at least, 2 in the yard behind him. His 4 against 4, possibly more. The math of what he'd planned had changed. "This is not finished," Voss said. "Get off my land," Garrett said. A long pause. The horses were restless. One of Voss's men said something low that she couldn't hear. Then the sound of them going. Hooves on the hard dirt, moving away. The sound diminishing down the road toward town and eventually gone. She came down the stairs. Garrett was still on the porch, standing at the rail, watching the road. She came out and stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a minute. "He'll come back with more," she said. "Yes. More than we have." "Probably." She looked at the dark yard. Miguel was at the barn door, the shotgun broken open at the elbow now, unhurried. Pete had materialized from somewhere on the far side of the corral and was leaning against the fence post in the particular way he had of occupying space economically. "We need more people," Clara said. "Yes." "Who?" Garrett thought about it. "There are people who'll stand with me, neighbors who've known this ranch, and—" He paused. "Some of them might stand with you now, too." She looked at him. "After the other night. After Eleanor Marsh, people know who you are. That's different than who they thought you were." He turned to look at her. "I think it's time we ask." She nodded. The night was cold and clear and enormous around them, the stars doing their density trick overhead. She was still holding the .22 and she realized she'd been holding it correctly. Her father had taken her shooting exactly twice, decades ago, and apparently her hands remembered. "I'll talk to Ruth in the morning," she said. "I'll talk to the Hendersons and Tom Grady," Garrett said. "And—" He stopped. "What?" "Doc Hennessy," he said. "He's not a fighting man, but he's respected. If he's visible, if he's seen to be on our side, it changes what Voss can claim about us." She thought about the doc's face when he'd examined Eleanor, the way he'd looked at Clara after and said reading counts. "I think he might be," she said. They stood on the porch a while longer, not out of particular purpose, but because neither of them was ready to go back inside yet. And the night was doing what nights do when they've had an incident in them. Settling, returning, becoming ordinary again by degrees. "Garrett," she said. "Yeah. Thank you. For handling that without telling me to hide." He was quiet a moment. "You were at the top of the stairs." "I was. But you gave me a rifle first." He made a sound that was almost something, not quite a laugh, not quite not. "Seemed like the right order of operations," he said. She looked at him in the dark, and he was looking back at her with the same quality she'd seen on occasion. The considering quality, the thing she didn't have a name for. And she looked away first, back at the road. Get some sleep, he said. Long day tomorrow. Yes, she said and went inside. She lay in her room with the 22 leaning against the wall beside the bed, which was either very practical or somewhat absurd and possibly both. And she thought about Voss's face when he'd heard Miguel and Pete in the yard. The small recalculation. He had not expected that. He had thought he was coming to a housekeeper and a rancher. He had not understood what 4 months of shared work builds. The particular loyalty that comes not from sentiment, but from doing things together until the doing becomes its own kind of bond. She thought about tomorrow, the conversations ahead. Ruth Okafor and Doc Hennessy and Garrett's neighbors, people she would have to ask for something she hadn't earned in the formal sense, hadn't lived here long enough to call in any real debts. And who would have to decide whether what she had earned in another sense was enough? She thought it might be. She thought the town was at a balance point, its judgment still in motion, and what happened next was going to tip it one way or the other. She was going to make sure it tipped right. Outside, she heard Miguel walk the perimeter of the yard once before going back to the barn, which was something he had apparently decided on his own to do, and the sound of his footsteps on the hard ground was steady and calm, and she held on to that sound as she went to sleep. The conversations happened over 3 days. Garrett rode to the Henderson place on Friday morning, 7 miles northeast, and came back in the early afternoon with the news that Frank Henderson would come and would bring his 2 sons, who were grown and capable and had reasons of their own to distrust men who arrived in small towns with money and agendas. Frank had apparently had an experience with exactly that type of man in Colorado 3 years prior and had not forgotten it. He said yes before Garrett finished asking. Tom Grady took longer. He was a cautious man by temperament, the kind who weighed things slowly and thoroughly, and was not moved by urgency alone. He listened to Garrett for 40 minutes, asked 7 questions, got answers to 6 of them, and said he'd think on it until Sunday. He came to the ranch on Saturday morning instead. Stop thinking, he said, which was apparently how Tom Grady committed to things. Clara's conversation with Ruth Okafor was different in quality. She rode out to Ruth's farm on Friday afternoon and found Ruth in her vegetable garden, harvesting the last of the season's sweet potatoes, and Clara pulled up and got off her horse and helped without being asked, working down the row beside Ruth in the cooling afternoon. She told Ruth the full version: the midnight visit, the 4 men, Voss's offer to Garrett to clear the banknote in exchange for Clara. Ruth listened and dug and listened and didn't say anything until Clara was done. He said he'd buy the debt, Ruth said. Yes. Ruth turned a sweet potato over in her hands, examining it. A man who thinks he can buy a woman also thinks he can buy a community. He's probably offering things to people in town, not as obviously, but offering. I think so. Bill Marsh at the land office. Ruth said it as a statement, not a question. He's been friendlier to that man than a stranger deserves. I noticed that. Ruth set the sweet potato in the basket. I'll come. My boys will come. She paused. I'll also talk to a few women, if that's all right with you. The ones whose husbands are likely to say yes, but who won't move until someone moves them. Clara looked at her. You'd do that? Ruth looked back with the directness that was her primary mode of communication. You pulled Eleanor Marsh back from something serious. Eleanor's carrying, which half the town knows now and the other half will by Monday. She paused again. And you've been walking down our main street for 6 months saying good morning to people who didn't say it back, and you kept saying it. I respect that. I don't respect many things, but I respect that. Clara felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she wasn't going to let go anywhere visible. Thank you, Ruth. Don't thank me yet, Ruth said. I haven't done anything. Let's see how Sunday goes. The conversation with Doc Hennessy was the one she'd been most uncertain about, because Doc Hennessy was not a man whose allegiances were easy to read. He was in his late 50s, competent and slightly remote, with the compressed manner of someone who has seen enough of human drama to have become selective about which dramas he engaged with. She found him at his office on Saturday afternoon, a small, clean room at the back of the hardware building, 2 examination chairs, and a cabinet of supplies and a desk buried in papers. He was writing when she knocked, and he looked up and gestured at the chair across from his desk without ceremony. She told him what she needed and why. He listened with the particular quality of attention of a man who is trained to notice what people say and what they're leaving out. When she finished, he sat back and laced his fingers. Voss has been to see me, he said. She hadn't known that, She kept her expression level. When? Earlier this week. He was very polite. He framed it as concern. Said you were a troubled woman, had left a stable situation, were perhaps not thinking clearly. He looked at her steadily. He was attempting to establish a medical opinion he could use. What did you tell him? I told him I don't form medical opinions without examination, and I don't provide them to third parties without patient consent. He paused. I then told him that, in my observation, the woman who correctly identified a cardiac arrhythmia in a pregnant woman in 90-degree heat and managed the situation appropriately until I arrived was demonstrably thinking more clearly than average. Clara exhaled slowly. Thank you. I'm telling you this because you should know what he's attempting, not because I want thanks. He picked up his pen and set it down again. What exactly do you need from me? Presence, mostly. Your visible support changes what Voss can claim about the situation. And if it becomes more than presence? I hope it won't. Hoping is different from knowing. Yes, she said, it is. He considered for a moment. I'll be there, he said. I'm not a fighting man, as I imagine Boone told you, but I'll be there. She stood to go. Doc Hennessy, has anyone else in town told you things about me? Things that weren't flattering? He looked at her with a slight shift of expression that might have been the outer edge of a smile. Miss Whitmore, I've been practicing medicine in small frontier towns for 22 years. People tell me things about their neighbors constantly. I have long since learned to form my own opinions. He returned to his papers. Shut the door on your way out. Sunday arrived with a cold clarity, the sky a deep and definite blue, and the air carrying the first real bite of coming autumn. Clara was up before light. She built the kitchen fire and made coffee and stood at the window while the color came back into the world gradually, the shapes of the barn and the corrals and the fence lines emerging from the dark by degrees. Garrett came down at 6. He took his coffee and stood beside her at the window for a moment, and neither of them spoke. How many do we have? Clara said finally. Frank Henderson and his 2 boys, Tom Grady, Ruth's husband and her 2 oldest. Pete knows 2 men from the old Callaway Drive who will ride out for the day. Miguel reached someone I don't know, said he's reliable. Doc Hennessy. He paused. And Bill Marsh sent word last night. She turned. Bill Marsh. I was surprised too, Garrett said. Apparently Ruth talked to Edna, who talked to Bill. What did she say to Edna? I don't know exactly, but Bill Marsh's message said, and I'm repeating it how Miguel told it to me, tell Boone I know which side of this I belong on. Clara thought about that, about Edna's single nod across the room after Eleanor's color came back, about the slow grinding work of 6 months of Wednesday mornings and good mornings said into silence, and one afternoon of knowing what to do when it needed to be done. About Ruth on her porch saying, you kept saying it. That's 12 counting us 4, Garrett said. Voss came with 4 last time. He'll come with more this time. Yes, he may have guns he's paying for. Garrett looked at his coffee. That's different than neighbors. I know. Our people are good people, Clara, but good people and hired guns aren't the same thing in a fight. She turned back to the window. The barn was fully visible now in the growing light, solid and red against the pale sky. We're not going to win by force of arms, she said. We never were. Then how? She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since the night of the midnight visit, through the 3 days of conversations, through the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head that had nothing to do with money. He needs this to be a private transaction, she said. He needs it to stay between him and you and me in some back arrangement nobody witnesses formally. The moment it's public, the moment there are 12 witnesses to what he's doing and why, it stops being a transaction and becomes something with legal consequences. Garrett looked at her. He hasn't broken any law yet. No. But if he comes here with hired guns and makes threats in front of 12 people, including a doctor and a land office official, he's building a case against himself. She turned to face him fully. He's a man who invests in land and moves money through charity organizations. He has a reputation he's maintained carefully. He cannot afford what this becomes if it goes badly for him publicly. Garrett was quiet for a moment. You're betting he'll back down. I'm betting he'll calculate. And if you're wrong, then we have 12 people and we do the best we can. She paused. I've been wrong before. I was wrong about him for 8 months. But I understand how he thinks now, and I don't think I'm wrong about this. He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Your read on him is better than mine." She turned back to the window. "He'll come before noon," she said. "He likes the morning, when people are less settled. He'll bring enough men to make the numbers clear without making the first move himself if he can help it." "Then we should be ready before noon." "Yes," she said. "We should." The Allies arrived between 8 and 10. They came quietly, without drama. Frank Henderson and his sons in a wagon, Tom Grady on horseback, Ruth's husband James and their 2 boys, Pete's 2 men from the drive, who turned out to be steady-looking and economical in their movements in the way of people who've been in difficult situations before. Doc Hennessy arrived at 9:30 in his buggy, in his good coat, and that small detail, the good coat, moved Clara in a way she hadn't anticipated. Bill Marsh arrived at 10 on the dot. He was a small, precise man who ran his office with careful attention to appearances, and he looked uncomfortable in the ranch yard in a way that said this was outside his normal territory, but he was there. He nodded to Clara when he came in, and she nodded back, and neither of them tried to make it more than it was. Garrett organized the placement without making speeches about it. He talked to each group briefly, where to position, what the plan was, what the priority was. The priority was clear. Nobody fires first. Nobody does anything to give Voss a legal position he doesn't currently have. If he comes with guns and makes threats, witnesses hear those threats and names get written down. If he pushes past that, they hold the line, but the line only. Clara was at the house. This was not entirely her preference, but she understood the logic. The house was the point of the conflict, and she needed to be visible at it, clearly present, clearly not moved. She was on the porch when the riders came over the low rise east of the house at 11:15. She counted them from a distance as they approached. 8. Voss and 7 men, and even from 100 yards she could see that several of the 7 had the particular way of carrying themselves that came from professional violence. Not violence committed occasionally, but routinely, with the practiced ease of men who had been paid for this kind of work before. She stood on the porch and did not move. Voss pulled up at this gate, the same point he'd pulled up before, and he looked at the yard. He took a long moment with it. The wagon, the horses, the men distributed with a deliberateness that was clearly not accidental. Doc Hennessy's buggy parked to one side, visible and specific. She watched him do the math. He rode in anyway. Some of his men followed, some stayed at the gate. He came to within 30 feet of the porch and stopped his horse. "Quite a gathering," he said. "We like company," Clara said. He looked at her. He was dressed well, better than the previous visits, as though he'd decided to make a formal occasion of it. And his face was composed in the way she remembered, the careful management of expression she'd once taken for genuine equanimity and now understood as the thing it actually was. "This is between you and me, Clara," he said. "You know that. You don't need these people here." "These people are my neighbors," she said. "They're here because they want to be." Neighbors. He said it the way you'd say a word in a foreign language you're not fluent in. "You've been here 9 months. That's enough time to be a neighbor," Ruth said. She was standing near the barn, and her voice was conversational, directed at no one in particular. Voss glanced toward her. Then he looked back at Clara, and his expression had shifted. Something moving underneath the composure. Something that had been contained for a long time and was running out of room. "I have a legal claim," he said, "on the financial instrument that governs this property. I've corresponded with the bank, and I'm prepared to act on—" "Mr. Voss!" Garrett spoke from the side of the house, where he'd been standing still enough that Voss apparently hadn't registered him. Voss turned. Garrett walked out to the yard at a steady pace and stopped 12 feet from Voss's horse. "I've had a telegraph conversation with the bank this week. Their position is that the note is current enough that no third-party action is imminent. They also mentioned that a gentleman from the East had been making inquiries they found unusual." He paused. "The bank's attorney is a man named Harrison. He suggested that if that gentleman continued making inquiries, there might be questions worth asking about how he came to have such specific knowledge of a private financial arrangement." Voss's horse shifted under him. He kept it still. "That's not—" He started and stopped. "I'm not threatening you," Garrett said. "I'm telling you the actual situation, instead of the situation you've been describing to Clara." He kept his voice even. You don't have the position you've been claiming. A silence. Long and specific. One of Voss's men, not the professional ones, but a man toward the back who had the look of someone hired locally and not briefed on all the details, said something quiet to the man beside him that Clara couldn't hear. She watched two of the professional men exchange a glance that had the quality of a calculation. Hired men, she thought. Men who were paid for a morning's work and had not signed on for something with 12 witnesses and legal complications, and a doctor in a good coat who was writing in a small notebook she'd noticed him take out about 5 minutes ago, presumably recording the time and parties present. "You've put a doctor to taking notes," Voss said. He was looking at Doc Hennessy now. "I make notes at unusual gatherings," Doc Hennessy said mildly. "Professional habit." Another silence. Then Voss looked at Clara. Just at her, directly, for a long moment, and she made herself hold it. She made herself look back at him with the same steadiness she'd been practicing for 9 months. The steadiness she'd developed by walking down a street every Wednesday and saying good morning to people who didn't say it back. "You won't make it here," he said. His voice was quieter now. The performance had come off it. What was underneath was harder and more honest. "You know that." "I don't know that," she said. "I think you believe it. I think you've believed something like it about me for a long time." She paused. "You were wrong." He held her eyes for 3 more seconds. She counted. Then he turned his horse. He rode out slowly, without hurry, without looking back, and his men went with him, and the 2 professional ones went last with the particular professional absence of emotion of men who have been in situations that ended various ways, and this one had ended this way, and now they were leaving. The yard was quiet. Clara realized she'd been holding her breath for the last 45 seconds and let it out. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything dramatic. Frank Henderson walked to the water trough and let his horse drink. One of Pete's men from the drive sat down on a fence post and took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair. Tom Grady said well in the way he apparently said most things, which was as if he'd arrived at a conclusion through careful deliberation. Ruth walked over and stood beside Clara. "He might come back," Ruth said. "He might," Clara said. "But I don't think he will." "What makes you sure?" "He's a man who needs a position he can't afford to lose. He came here and he showed his hand in front of 12 people and it didn't work." She watched the dust of Voss's departure settle on the road east. "He'll go somewhere he can reestablish, where nobody's seen what just happened." Ruth considered this. "You know how he thinks." "Unfortunately." "That's not unfortunate," Ruth said. "That's the thing that won." The aftermath was not tidy. There was food, because Clara had prepared for this. 2 days of cooking, the good coffee, bread and cold meat, and preserves from the root cellar, and people stayed for an hour and ate and talked, and the yard had the loose, slightly relieved quality of people who had prepared for worse and got something manageable. Garrett moved through it quietly. He shook hands with Frank Henderson and talked briefly to Tom Grady, and said something to Bill Marsh that made Bill nod with a gravity that looked like apology, and Garrett received it without making a production of it. He was not a man who needed to make productions of things. Doc Hennessy found Clara as he was leaving. He had his good coat buttoned now against the autumn air, and his notebook in his coat pocket, and he looked at her with the specific expressiveness of a man who rarely shows what he feels. "You were prepared," he said. "I tried to be." The positioning of people in that yard was intelligent, visible enough to give Voss full information without being arranged for confrontation. "I wanted him to see the whole picture before he decided anything. And his men saw it too," Doc said. "The ones he was paying, that mattered." She hadn't expected him to understand that specifically. "Yes," she said, "it did." He climbed into his buggy. "You read widely," he said. "That's useful out here. More useful than most people think." He gathered his reins. "I may have a question for you about herbs one of these days. Medicinal applications." "I'd be glad to," she said. He nodded and drove out, and she watched him go. The yard emptied over the next hour, and the afternoon came down clear and cold and still. Miguel and Pete began the end-of-day work with the animals, the familiar sounds of feed and water, and the low conversations men have with horses. Clara went inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at the room, the stove, the cabinet, the window with the garden visible beyond it, most of it gone to its autumn exhaustion now, and she put her hand flat on the table, solid, present. Garrett came in a while later and stood in the doorway and looked at her and then at the room. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She thought about it. "I don't entirely feel it yet, but yes." "That takes a while," he said. "How do you know?" He came and sat at the table, and she sat across from him, and he was quiet for a moment with his hands folded on the wood. "After Helen died," he said, "I kept expecting to feel better, expecting the day when I'd wake up and the weight would be different. And for a long time it wasn't." He paused. "Then one morning I was out at the east fence, and I noticed the grass had come back in the section that always floods, and I thought, all right, it'll come back. Most things come back if you let them." He looked at her. "The feeling catches up. It just takes time." She held that. "Is that what happened? It came back?" "Some of it," he said. "Maybe not all of it, but enough." They sat in the kitchen while the light went out of the afternoon and became evening, and Miguel brought in firewood and started the stove. And after a while, Clara got up and put dinner together from what was there, and they ate with the warmth of the fire and the sounds of the ranch settling into its nighttime self around them. 3 days later, Garrett told her the hotel owner had let Voss's room to someone else. He'd left without announcement, packed his things, settled his bill, ridden out on a Tuesday morning, and the man at the hotel who told Garrett this had the tone of someone reporting a minor weather event. Voss had come and gone, and the town had already begun the process of folding the episode into its accumulated history, making it smaller than it was, which was what small towns did with things that were large and uncomfortable. Clara sat with the news for a moment. Is he actually gone, or is he just not in the hotel? John Prater saw him on the East Road Tuesday morning with his bags on his horse, Garrett said, heading toward Cheyenne. That's east. It is, she breathed. He might come back. He might. Garrett looked at her steadily. We handled it once. She thought about what he'd said at the east fence about the grass coming back, about most things coming back if you let them. Yes, she said. We did. The days continued. She went to town on Wednesday as usual. John Prater said good morning, and she said it back, and it was the same exchange it had been for months, except that something in its texture was different. Fuller, maybe, or simply more true. Mrs. Calloway stopped her to ask about preserving summer squash through winter, which Clara answered from the reading she'd done, and Mrs. Calloway thanked her, and the conversation went on past that, drifting into things tangential and domestic. And it lasted 10 minutes before they both had other places to be. Edna Marsh was outside the dry goods. She was wearing the hat that had been damaged, Clara noticed, and it had been repaired, not with the grosgrain Clara had suggested, but with a slightly different ribbon that worked well enough. She almost walked past. Then she stopped. The ribbon is good, Clara said. That color works better than grosgrain would have. Edna looked at her hat and then at Clara. Her expression went through several things in quick succession. My daughter-in-law chose it, she said. Eleanor has good taste. A pause. Something moved in Edna Marsh's face. Not transformation, not conversion, but something more honest than those. Something that was simply a person looking at another person and adjusting a long-held position by a small but real degree. She's doing well, Edna said. Resting. The doctor says the baby is fine. I'm glad, Clara said. And she was. Simply, directly glad. Edna nodded. She opened her mouth and then closed it, and then opened it again, and what came out was not an apology exactly, but was structured like one, the bones of one, without all the flesh. The morning you arrived in Iron Hollow, she said, what I said to Mrs. Prater, Mrs. Marsh, Clara said gently, you don't have to. I want to, Edna said, and she said it with the fierceness of a woman who does not enjoy this and is doing it anyway because she has decided to. What I said wasn't fair. You hadn't done anything to earn it. Clara held this carefully. Thank you, she said. That means something. It did mean something, not because she needed Edna Marsh's good opinion exactly, but because Edna's bad opinion had been an early shape that the town had taken on around her, and this was that shape-shifting, the slow creek-bed change of a thing you thought was permanent. She walked back to the wagon where Garrett was waiting with the supplies, and she climbed up and they pulled out of Iron Hollow with the mid-October light long and low across the prairie. How was town? He said. Edna Marsh apologized. He glanced sideways at her. Did she? Sort of, as much as she could. Clara watched the road. It was enough. He nodded, and they rode in the easy quiet they'd been building for months. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like silence, but like company. The ranch appeared on the horizon, its familiar shape solid against the afternoon sky. The house with the new porch boards, the barn in its good repair, the bare garden waiting for what she was already planning for spring. The horses in the corral were visible from a long way out, moving in the unhurried way of animals who are warm and fed and not afraid of anything. She looked at it all coming toward her as the wagon moved, and she thought about what she'd said to Voss on that last afternoon, standing on the porch with 12 people in the yard, and the autumn coming in cold and clear. I think you've believed something like it about me for a long time. You were wrong. She had meant that. She had meant every word of it. But sitting in the wagon now, with the ranch growing larger and the day ending behind them in long orange light, she understood it differently than she had when she'd said it. Understood that she hadn't quite believed it herself. Not completely. Not until she'd said it out loud to him and felt it stay true. She believed it now. Garrett pulled up at the barn, and they climbed down, and the horses needed attention, and there was dinner to make, and the stove would need wood, and Miguel was already at the barn door with the unhurried competence he brought to the end of every day. And she walked toward the house with her parcels and her coat against the cold, and her feet on the ground she'd been walking on for 9 months. It did not feel borrowed. It had not felt borrowed for some time. She went inside and built the fires. The first snow came on a Thursday in early November, which Miguel said was later than usual, and Pete said was about right, and Garrett said nothing because he was already on the roof of the barn checking the seam above the east stall that had leaked the previous winter. Clara stood in the yard and watched the snow come down. Not heavy, just the first tentative announcement of it, flakes that weren't quite sure of themselves yet. And she turned her face up to it the way she had not done since she was a child in Boston, when snow was still a novelty and not simply another thing to navigate. It landed on her cheeks and her eyelashes and melted immediately. The garden was already put to bed, the beds mulched and the herbs cut back, and the last of the root vegetables in the cellar. The preserves were on the shelves. The wood was stacked higher than it had been any previous year on this ranch, according to Miguel, who tracks such things with the attention of someone who has spent winters understanding what insufficient wood actually means. She had been here a year. Not quite. She'd arrived in March, so it was 8 months, not 12. But it felt like a year in the sense that she had seen the full circle of a season, from the bare cold of the frontier spring through the grinding heat of summer and out the other side into this, the first snow of a new winter coming down on a life she had built inside of nothing. She was aware that she was about to become sentimental about it, and she talked herself off that ledge, because sentimentality was a luxury that required a certain stability she wasn't prepared to claim yet. Things were better. Things were not finished. Garrett came down from the roof with mud on his knees and looked at her standing in the snow. "Seem held," he said. "Good. You're getting snow in your hair." "I know." He looked at her for a moment with the considering expression she'd cataloged extensively over the past months, the one that preceded him saying something real. "Come inside when you're done," he said, and went in. She stood for another minute. The snow was thickening, committing now, and the ridgelines to the east were going white at the tops, and the yard was beginning to hold it on its surfaces. And she thought about what Doc Hennessy had said about reading counts, and about what Ruth had said about good mornings, and about what Miguel's mother had apparently known about full pantries and short winters. She thought about the fact that she had arrived in Iron Hollow with $38 and a travel bag and had been publicly discarded inside of 20 minutes, and that she was still here, and that the banknote Voss had threatened to buy had in fact been renegotiated in September through a series of letters between Garrett and the Cheyenne Bank's attorney that Clara had helped draft, because she had a head for language and Garrett knew it and had asked without embarrassment, and the new terms were manageable in a way the old terms hadn't quite been. She had helped to draft the letters that secured the ranch's financial future. That was not a small thing, and she let herself know it was not a small thing, standing in the first snow, before she went inside and stopped being sentimental about it. The letter from her sister Eleanor arrived in November. It had been in transit for 3 weeks, having gone first to the Correspondence Club's Boston address, and then been forwarded, and by the time it reached her, it had the well-traveled look of a document that had moved through many hands. She opened it at the kitchen table one evening after dinner when Garrett had gone to his desk and the house was in its nighttime quiet. Eleanor's letter was Eleanor's, careful, loving, anxious in the particular way of someone who loves you and expresses it primarily through worry. She asked after Clara's health. She asked after the situation with the man from Boston, which told Clara that Cade Voss had made some attempt to establish his version of events through mutual acquaintances, because Eleanor knew about him now in a way that suggested she'd been told a story. She asked whether Clara was happy, and she asked it the way someone asks a question when they expect the answer to be complicated. Clara wrote back that same evening, 6 pages, which was more than she'd written to Eleanor since leaving. She did not write about Voss directly. Not yet, not in the way the situation deserved. But she wrote about the ranch, and the garden, and the first snow and the preservation jars in the cellar, and Ruth Okafor and Doc Hennessy, and the Wednesday mornings, and Edna Marsh's ribbon-repaired hat, and Eleanor Marsh's recovery, and the way the light came across the ridgelines in the late afternoon in October. She wrote about Miguel's mother's saying about full pantries. She wrote about the stove's temperament and what she'd learned about working with it rather than against it. She did not write I am happy because it wasn't that simple, and Eleanor deserved something more accurate than that. She wrote, I am here, and here is mine in a way nothing has been before, and I think I understand now that this is what I was looking for when I left. Not the man or the arrangement or the security, but this feeling that the ground under my feet is ground I've earned. I didn't know that's what I was looking for, but I found it anyway, which is probably how most real things get found. She sealed the letter and put it by the door to go out with Garrett on Saturday, and she sat at the table for a while after in the lamplight and thought that she hadn't been entirely honest with Eleanor even now. Not dishonest exactly, but incomplete. The incomplete part was Garrett. She had been circling that part for months, setting it aside with the same discipline she applied to the things in her life that needed patience, that needed to be left alone to develop at their own pace instead of being hurried. Garrett was not a man you could hurry, and she was not, at this point in her life, a woman who wanted to rush past things to get to the result. She had done that before. She understood now what it cost. What she knew was this. The house had changed. Not the physical house, though that had changed too, in the ways she'd made it change, but the quality of the air inside it, the texture of the hours they spent in the same rooms. Garrett had started leaving books on the kitchen table, not presented, just left there, as though by accident, and they were the kind of books that told her something about how he thought. He had started asking her opinion on ranch decisions, not just the domestic ones, about the spring planting, about which pasture to rest, about the offer he'd gotten from a man in Cheyenne for the north quarter of the property. He listened when she answered in a way that made clear the listening was real. And there was the smaller thing, the accumulation of small things that meant something in aggregate, even when each one alone could be explained away. The coffee jar that reappeared on the table full every time it was close to empty, bought on Saturdays without being mentioned. The way he checked, without making it visible, that she had firewood in her room before the temperature dropped. The evening in late October when she had come in from the garden, tired and frustrated about the late squash that had rotted on the vine before she could get to it, and he had poured her coffee without being asked and set it on the table and said nothing, which was exactly what the moment needed and which he had somehow understood. She was not going to act on any of this. She was going to leave it where it was and let it be whatever it was going to be without pushing it, because she had pushed things before and she understood the cost of that too. But she was also not going to pretend to herself that it wasn't there, because pretending things weren't there had also cost her, and she was done paying for that particular mistake. December came with a seriousness the first snow hadn't prepared her for. She had read about frontier winters. She had not, until now, experienced one, and the difference between reading about a thing and living it was the same gap it always was, which was the gap between a map and the actual terrain. The cold was not simply cold. It was a presence, specific and unignorable, and it changed everything from how long you could be outside to how much wood the fire needed to what you could reasonably expect from a day's work. She adapted. She had discovered over the past months, a woman who adapted, not easily, not without complaint, but with the persistent practicality of someone who would rather solve a problem than grieve it. She adapted her cooking for warmth and staying power. She adapted her schedule so that the things requiring outdoor movement happened in the middle of the day when the temperature was at its least brutal. She bought a second pair of heavy gloves in town and felt this to be one of the better decisions of her adult life. The snow kept her in more, which meant she and Garrett spent more time in the house together, which meant the conversations deepened in the way conversations deepen when you have nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. He told her about Helen in December in pieces over several evenings, not in a way that felt like grieving openly, which he understood was not in his constitution, but in the quiet way of someone setting down something they've been carrying too long. He told her that Helen had been a woman of strong opinions who was almost always right, which had been both difficult and reassuring. He told her that the worst part of the first year after wasn't the large things but the small ones, not the absence at meals, but the habit of starting a sentence and then remembering there was no one to finish it to. He told her that he had not been a perfect husband, that he had been absent in the way men of his type were absent, present in the body and distant in the mind, too absorbed in the ranch's needs to understand what Helen needed until it was too late to give her more of it. She knew, he said. She knew what I was like when she married me. She didn't pretend I was going to be different. He paused. But knowing what someone is like doesn't mean you don't wish they were a little different sometimes. No, Clara said. It doesn't. Did you wish that about Voss, that he'd be different? She thought about it honestly. I didn't know him well enough to wish for a different version. I think I wished he was someone else entirely, that the man I thought he was in the beginning was the real one. She turned her coffee cup. But that man didn't exist. I was making someone out of what he showed me, and what he showed me was constructed. You couldn't have known that early on. I could have known it sooner than I did, she said. I stayed longer than I should have. I knew something was wrong, and I told myself I was misreading it. That's not stupidity, Garrett said. That's just being human. People misread things they don't want to be true. She looked at him. Is that what happened with the bank? With the note being behind? He didn't flinch from it. After Helen, I wasn't on top of it the way I should have been. I let things go. I told myself it was manageable, and I didn't look hard enough at whether that was actually true. But it was manageable, she said. Ultimately. With help, he said. He looked at her steadily. That's the other thing I wasn't good at, asking for help. She held his eyes. You asked me. Not exactly. Something shifted in his expression. Something that was almost a smile. The real kind, not the polite kind. I offered you a job. Which was the same thing with better dignity for both of us. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. Yeah, he said. Maybe it was. They sat in the kitchen with the fire going and the snow outside building up in the window corners and the lamp burning between them, and she thought about what she'd written to Eleanor. Here is mine in a way nothing has been before, and she thought it was still true, and was becoming more true in a way she hadn't entirely predicted. What? On a Sunday in late December, Garrett asked her to walk the north pasture with him. He went out to check that pasture periodically, looking at the grass and the fence and the general condition of the land the way he looked at everything, with the practical affection of someone whose care for a thing expresses as attention rather than sentiment. He had never asked her to come along before. She put on her coat and her good gloves and went. The pasture in winter was different from the pasture in summer in the obvious ways and also in ways that were harder to name. The grass was dead and flat under the snow, but you could see the structure of it, the underlying patterns of how it grew and where the water ran and where the ridge protected it from the worst of the north wind. She walked beside Garrett and he pointed things out, not as explanation but as sharing. The way the south-facing slope would green first in spring, the section by the creek that flooded reliable and then recovered reliable, the old fence line that predated his ownership. The man I bought this from, he said, built that fence by hand. No help. Just him and a post hole digger in several months. He looked at it. Weathered wood, some posts leaning, but holding. He told me when I bought the place that the fence would outlast us both. I didn't entirely believe him. And now? Now I think he was probably right. They walked to the north edge of the pasture where the ridge came down and the land dipped slightly, sheltered. The snow was less here, blown clear by the ridge in a way that left a patch of flattened grass visible in pale gold against the white. This is where Helen wanted to build eventually, Garrett said. A second structure. Something we talked about but never got to. Clara said nothing. She looked at the sheltered ground. I'm going to build it, he said. In the spring. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the ground, at the patch of pale grass. What kind of structure? I don't know yet. He looked at her. I thought you might have ideas. She held his gaze. The wind came across the ridge and moved between them, cold and clean. I have some ideas, she said. I thought you might. She looked back at the ground. Garrett. Yeah. What are we talking about? A pause. The honest kind, not the evasive kind. I'm not good at this, he said. You know that by now. I know. I'm also not going to pretend things aren't the way they are. He looked at her directly, the way he looked at everything when he'd decided to look at it. You've been part of this place since before I understood that's what was happening. You've made it different, better. Not because of the cabinet or the garden, though those matter. Because of how you move through it, how you think about it. He paused. I'd like you to keep doing that. More officially. More officially, she said. If that's something you want. She thought, as she often did, about how to say something true without saying too much of it all at once. I wrote to my sister, she said, that this place is mine in a way nothing has been before. I didn't tell her why I felt that because I wasn't sure I understood it yet. Do you understand it now? Getting there, she said. Something loosened in his expression. I'll take getting there, he said. You'll have to. I don't move fast when it matters. Neither do I. A pause, and then again the not-quite laugh, the real one. We'd be terrible at anything impulsive. Probably, she said. Between us, we'd think about it so long the opportunity would pass. Already did that, he said. Several times. She looked at him, at the careful, private face she'd been learning for 8 months. The face that showed less than it felt and felt considerably more than it showed. And she thought about the stagecoach landing and Margaret Aldridge's voice and the feel of the frontier dust settling on her shoulders and the $38 and the travel bag and the 4 miles to this ranch on an unpaved road in the early morning with nothing arranged or guaranteed. Ask me properly, she said. When you're ready, I'm not going anywhere. His eyes held hers for a moment. I know, he said, and she understood that he meant something larger by it than just the immediate thing, that he'd known for a while, that it was the knowing that had made certain things possible. That's the thing that changed everything, he said, when I understood you weren't going to leave. I almost did, she said, the first morning. I know, I thought you would. What would you have done? He thought about it. Managed, he said. Same as always. A pause. But it would have been less. Less. She received that word and held it, and found it to be the most accurate and the most generous thing he could have said, and she turned back to the pale grass on the sheltered ground, and she thought about spring. Well, January was long. January on the frontier was not a philosophical experience. It was a physical one, continuous and specific, and it asked for the same things every day. Warmth, work, patience, enough food and wood to get through until the next morning when it asked for them again. There was no romance in it, and Clara did not try to make any. She simply moved through it the way you move through necessary things, with her head down and her attention on what was in front of her. But there were evenings when the work was done and the house was warm and the lamps were lit, and Garrett read at his desk while she read at the kitchen table, and sometimes one of them said something and the other answered, and sometimes they didn't. Evenings when Miguel came in for something and stayed for coffee and talked about his family in a way he was slowly becoming willing to do, and she listened and asked questions that were actually curious, and he answered them in the same spirit. Evenings when Pete appeared at the door to report something about the horses and ended up sitting at the table for 20 minutes talking about a horse he'd owned in Texas 8 years ago, which was the most she'd heard Pete say about anything in 8 months. And she kept very still while he talked so as not to startle him off the subject. She wrote more letters to Eleanor. She wrote one to a woman she'd taught with for 4 years in Boston, whom she'd thought about often and not contacted because the letter would require explaining things she hadn't wanted to explain. She wrote it now and explained them in the honest, unpolished way of someone who has finally stopped managing their own story and started just telling it. She received a letter in January from Doc Hennessy, which surprised her. He was not, she thought, a letter writer. and which turned out to be a request. He had a patient with a recurring digestive complaint that had not responded to the standard remedies, and he had remembered something Clara had mentioned about a medicinal use for certain herbs, and he wondered if she had any further reading on the subject. She spent 2 evenings going through her books and wrote back a 4-page response with as many citations as she could construct from memory. He wrote back once more saying her information had been helpful. She did not expect it to become a correspondence, and it did not exactly become one, but twice more over the winter he sent notes with specific questions, and she answered them, and each time she felt the particular satisfaction of knowing something useful to someone who needed it, which was a feeling she had not recognized in herself until she was out here where what you knew had immediate application to what happened to people. In February, Eleanor Marsh had her baby, a girl, healthy, delivered by Doc Hennessy with no complications. Clara heard about it from Ruth, who heard about it from Mrs. Calloway, who had apparently been present and was characteristically effusive about the whole event. Clara sent a jar of preserved plums to the Marsh house with a note that said nothing except congratulations. C. Whitmore. 2 days later, Edna Marsh appeared at the ranch. She came on horseback, which suggested some determination, and she was wearing a coat Clara recognized as her good one. She knocked at the front door with the same authority she'd always had, but when Clara opened the door, there was something different in her posture. It not diminished, but shifted. "I came to thank you," Edna said, "for the preserves and for—" She stopped, reorganized. Eleanor wanted to name the baby. Clara waited. "Catherine," Edna said, "after her grandmother." But she asked if she could also use Clara as a middle name. She held Clara's eyes with the effort of a woman who is doing something unfamiliar. "She said you were the reason she wasn't afraid." Clara stood in the doorway of the ranch house that was not hers by any document and looked at Edna Marsh, who had been the first person in Iron Hollow to form an opinion of her and had formed the worst one available. She didn't say it was nothing, because it wasn't nothing. She didn't make it larger than it was, because that would embarrass them both. She said, "Eleanor is brave. That's her own quality. I just happened to be there." "You knew what to do," Edna said. "That's not nothing." "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't." Edna nodded. She looked at the house, at the porch with its good boards and the winter-bare garden beyond the fence and the smoke coming from the chimney. "You've done well here," she said. "I've worked hard here," Clara said. "That's not the same thing, but it's a start." Something in Edna's face shifted in a way that might have been respect if it had fully formed. It didn't quite fully form, but it moved in that direction, which was Edna Marsh's version of a significant concession. "Well," Edna said, and gathered her reins. "Thank you for coming," Clara said. "Tell Eleanor congratulations from me." Edna rode out. Garrett appeared at the corner of the house where he'd been, she suspected, doing absolutely nothing in particular. "How long were you there?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. She looked at him. "Did you hear about the baby's name?" "I heard." She turned back to the road where Edna Marsh was a diminishing figure in the winter afternoon. "Catherine Clara," she said. She said it to try how it felt. It felt strange and real and something else she didn't have a word for. "She'll be a handful," Garrett said. "2 strong names." "She will," Clara said. "Good." Spring came back the way Garrett had said it would, decisively, all at once, as though it had been waiting somewhere nearby and simply chose a morning to arrive. The grass came in green and urgent, and the garden beds she'd mulched held their structure well, and the herbs were already showing new growth from the bases, the ones she'd left in place. And she stood at the edge of the beds with her hands on her hips and felt, as she had come to feel about the garden, the particular satisfaction of something that came back because you'd cared for it correctly. She put in tomatoes again. More this time. Miguel had been right about his mother's method. She put them closer together and they would support each other in the heat, the way plants and other things do when they're close enough. She put in beans and squash and onions in a section she'd been planning through the winter of medicinal herbs, the ones Doc Hennessy had been asking about, valerian and echinacea, and a variety of mint she'd ordered through the general store, which had arrived looking unlikely and was now, in the warming April soil, looking considerably more possible. Ruth came to look at the herb section one afternoon with the focused attention of someone making an evaluation. "The valerian will spread," Ruth said. "You know that. I'm counting on it." It'll take over if you let it. I'll manage it. She looked at the beds. Doc Hennessy wants regular supply. If it does well, I'll put in a second section next year. Ruth looked at her. You're planning to be here next year? I'm planning to be here indefinitely, Clara said. Ruth nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose read on a situation has been confirmed. Good, she said. Iron Hollow could use someone who knows useful things. She paused. There are women here who have questions they don't ask the doctor because it doesn't occur to them the doctor's interested, or because they can't afford a visit, or because it's particular. Women's questions. Clara understood what she was saying. I'll make myself available, she said. I'm not a doctor. They'd need to understand that. They understand. They just need someone to ask. Clara thought of the 4 pages she'd written to Doc Hennessy about digestive complaints. She thought of Eleanor Marsh's cardiac episode and the cold cloth on the back of a neck and the slow work of managed breathing. She thought of all the reading she'd done in Boston in her rented room with the good lamp, reading that had seemed purely personal and had turned out to be more useful than 7 years of teaching. Tell them to come on Wednesdays, she said. I go to town anyway. Ruth's version of a smile was brief and genuine. I'll tell them. Garrett broke ground on the North Pasture structure in April. He and Frank Henderson's boys did the foundation over 3 days, and Pete and Miguel did the framing over a week, and Clara made lunches and asked questions at the end of each day about what had been done and what the plan was for the next day. She had given Garrett her ideas in February, sitting at the kitchen table with paper and a pencil, and he had looked at them seriously and incorporated most of them and explained why 2 of them wouldn't work structurally, and she had accepted this because his reasons were sound. It was going to be a simple structure, a room and a half, a main room with a proper window facing south, and a smaller attached room with shelving built in. Clara intended the shelving for her growing collection of medicinal supplies. Garrett did not say what he intended the main room for, and she did not ask, because they understood each other well enough by now to leave certain things to develop at their own pace. He asked her one evening in April, on the porch after dinner, with the spring air finally warm enough to sit in and the light going long and gold across the yard. He didn't do it formally. He didn't have the words arranged, and she was glad about that because arranged words from Garrett would have sounded wrong, and they both would have known it. What he said was, I meant what I said in the pasture about wanting you here properly. He looked at the yard, not at her. I know I take a long time with things. I know you do, she said. This isn't... I'm not confused about it. I've known for a while. I know that too, she said. He looked at her then. Is that a yes, or are you going to make me actually ask? She considered. I'm going to make you actually ask. Something moved in his face that was entirely the real version of the almost smile, the one she'd been seeing since August. Clara Whitmore, he said. Will you stay? I'll stay, she said. Permanently. Permanently. He nodded. He didn't reach for her hand because he was a man who moved slowly toward things, which she had known from the beginning and had come to value in a way she couldn't have predicted. But he looked at her with the full quality of his attention, the same attention he gave to everything he cared about, the fence lines and the grass and the horses and the ranch's accounts, and she felt it land. All right then, he said. All right, she agreed. They sat on the porch in the April evening, and the yard was full of the sounds of the place doing its end-of-day things, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was insisting on something, and the ridge lines were doing the purple and gold business they did every evening without caring whether anyone was watching. And Clara thought about a woman who had arrived on a stagecoach with $38 and 1 bag and been publicly told she was not enough, and who had stood at the edge of the boardwalk in the frontier dust and decided not to run. She thought about what that decision had actually been. Not brave, exactly. She hadn't felt brave, she'd felt angry, and then stubborn, and then practical, which is the ordinary sequence of things when you're forced to make a choice with no good options. Not a plan, not a vision of what was coming, just the refusal to move in the direction of retreat, which was the smallest and most essential thing, the thing that started everything that followed. This was what she understood now that she hadn't understood in March of the previous year, and that she couldn't have been told, could only have arrived at by living through it. That you do not find out what you're made of in advance. You find out in the middle of things, when you're already committed and it's too late to reconsider. And what you find out is usually not what you expected, which is sometimes worse and sometimes considerably better. She had found out something better. She was not who she had been in Boston, not worse than that woman, and not simply better. Changed, specifically, in the ways that the frontier changes people when it changes them at all, which is by stripping away the things you carried that you thought you needed and showing you what's actually load-bearing. The thing that was load-bearing in her, it turned out, was not the careful management of other people's opinions or the maintenance of a small, safe life or the patient waiting for something better to be offered. It was the walking into the street, the saying good morning, the turning toward the sound of trouble, the staying. That was load-bearing. Everything else was furniture. Iron Hollow was not the place she had come to find. She had come to find Thomas Aldridge and a marriage and a conventional frontier life with its conventional satisfactions, and none of that had happened. And she had gotten instead something she did not have a ready category for, which was a life she had built herself out of what was available, and which was therefore not conventional and not what she'd planned and was, in most of the ways that actually mattered, more truly hers than anything planned could have been. She thought about the woman who would arrive on next spring's stagecoach, or the one after that, or the woman already somewhere in a city sitting in a rented room reading letters and building a picture of something that didn't exist yet. She thought about what she would say to that woman if she could, and she thought that what she would say was not inspiring, not the kind of thing you'd put on a sign or carry in a speech. She would say, "You're going to be more wrong than you expect, and you're going to survive it, and the surviving is not the point, but it's where everything that matters starts." She would say, "Good morning," even when no one says it back. She would say, "Stay." The meadowlark had stopped somewhere in the dusk. The lamp was lit inside, and its light came through the kitchen window and lay on the porch boards in a warm yellow square. Garrett got up after a while and went in, not asking if she was coming, because he knew she'd come when she was ready, which was how they understood each other. She sat for another few minutes with the spring air on her face and the darkness coming in from the east and the ranch making its nighttime sounds around her. Familiar now, entirely familiar, not the sounds of something foreign, but the sounds of the place she lived. And then she got up and went inside. The door closed behind her. The lamp was on. The stove was warm. On the kitchen table, because Garrett had set it there without comment sometime in the last hour, was a fresh jar of the good coffee. She picked it up and looked at it and set it down and thought, yes, all right, this.